Hi everyone, it's Sammy Osmond here from the Climate Action Reserve. Just like to welcome you all to this fourth workgroup meeting for our Soil Enrichment Protocol development effort. Very glad to have you all here. Still a lot of people that have registered that are logging in, so we'll pause for just a couple of minutes and let those folks continue to log in, and then we'll kick things off in just a couple of minutes' time.
So I'm gonna go do my math and then I'll mix.
Morning, everyone. To the workgroup members I've upgraded as panelists, you can mute yourselves. So I just wanted to let you know that we can hear you now. Hopefully you can hear us. And then I'll have you self-mute on your end. Thanks.
Great, thanks Heather. And welcome everyone. Again, it's Sammy Osmond here from Climate Action Reserve. Just like to welcome you all to this fourth workgroup meeting for our Soil Enrichment Protocol development effort. Just take you through a little bit by way of housekeeping to start with. So workgroup members will actively be participating, we hope, throughout the session today. And just like to remind you that you do have speaking abilities, so we will be able to hear each other at all times. So for that reason, if you can keep yourselves muted unless and until you would like to speak, that'd be perfect, especially in these pandemic times when we've got the sort of cats and dogs running in the room. We will ask and also take questions throughout the session. So you will see that there are a number of ways that both the workgroup as well as observers can put information into the discussion. There's a user interface which usually pops up on the right-hand side of the screen. Right at the bottom there's a chat function, but there's also a question box. So it's probably easiest if we all use that question box. You can open it up, type in questions at any point. So we will have staff that are sitting here that will be able to observe those as they come in, and they might choose to engage and start the discussion there. But we will also have time to circle back and look at some of those questions towards the end of this webinar and hopefully pick up on some of those discussions that we haven't had verbally throughout the session. For all workgroup members, as we did previously, we'd encourage you to speak up verbally. Feel free to use the question function, but really it will probably be most effective if we generate good verbal discussion during this meeting. One good reason is it'll help any other observers to be able to more actively observe and engage in those discussions. As it says on the slide here, we'll also be able to follow up via email. So I think with all of these sessions, we've had a great amount of discussion, questions and chat, and we've followed up in each instance, try to follow up as thoroughly as we could to answer any of those residual questions or ongoing discussions. So you can certainly expect we'll do that via email. Right at the end of this session, we will be providing you with our email contact addresses for a good number of those contacts there for myself and also the broader team. And we will make a copy of the presentation, a recording of the presentation will be posted online, and a copy of the slides will also be made available. In fact, Heather from our team has already put the slides, a copy of the slides in the handout function for the GoToWebinar. So if you go back over to that user interface in the top right-hand screen, the second row on my screen from the bottom says handouts. And if you click on the drop-down arrow there, you can see there's a couple of documents uploaded. We've got the slides, and then a couple of other documents that we provided to the work group, so you can access them there as well. Just go through a little bit by way of an agenda for today's meeting. So in a moment, we will go through and give introductions. I'll probably ask our team here at the Reserve to say a quick hello so you know who's on the call. Then from there, we'll also go through and show you again the full work group. We haven't asked the work group to make full introductions, not since the first work group meeting, because there are quite a few of you there, and also we don't want to catch you off guard. What we might do, if folks are open to it, is perhaps run through a roll call. We had some work group members express that they thought that might be quite useful, so we can at least see who managed to make it to this meeting from that work group. So not to catch you off guard, but we might ask work group members, I can perhaps run through the list and we can just have those folks confirm, or I'll be able to confirm if we see your name that's already logged in. From there, we'll go back to give an overview of the process itself. So we'll just couch this webinar back into the context of the broader effort that we're doing here and just sort of run through what that process looks like. We'll also reflect on next steps in the process. From there, we'll move to a discussion of the substantive issues that we're most interested in running through with you today, which is a lot of the really good public comments we received during our public comment period. We'll also touch on some of the Reserve thinking in response to it. And then from there, we'll also go through a good number of proposed changes that the Reserve team has come up with. A lot of those you'll see are directly in response to some of the really useful feedback that we've received, not only during the public comment process, but also from members of the work group and other stakeholders throughout this process. From there, as we said, we'll be able to pause and get back into some questions and further discussion. To make it clear though, we welcome the work group to jump in at any time if they'd like to engage in the content. And in fact, that's probably going to be the most productive if we can have open discussion throughout. Nonetheless, it's a long 3 hours today, so we should have time to come back at that later point and really get into any points of discussion that we haven't already raised throughout. From there, finish off with a little bit by way of next steps, point to you what you can expect in the immediate future and henceforth. So again, thank you very much for joining us. And let me pause for one moment. Looks like we've got a little bit of chat. Just make sure it's not with respect to my audio or anything. Nope, looks like thumbs up, still working. That's good. Looks like my screen was paused though. There we go. Now you should be able to see the agenda. Just pause there for a minute in case you want to see that. Okay, we'll move into introductions now. So first off, I'll hand it over to Craig Eppert, the Reserve President, to say a few quick words. Would you like to say hello, Craig?
Thanks, Sammy, and welcome to everybody on today's call. On behalf of the Climate Action Reserve, I really want to thank the members of the working group for participating. You folks represent a real diverse set of perspectives on this very important issue, and we really appreciate the time and energy that you dedicated to helping to improve this process. And I know there's some other stakeholders participating today. You know, our process always has been a very public, transparent, interactive engagement, and today is certainly no exception. So again, thanks for coming on board today.
Great, thanks, Craig. Just a quick reminder, my name is Sammy Osborne, second name down there, Senior Policy Manager. So for this particular effort, I'll be the Protocol Development Lead, which just means I'll be gently steering the ship. You'll have my contact details. If you don't already, feel free to reach out at any point. And yeah, very privileged to be here, and thank you. Pass it on. Would you like to say a quick hello, Heather?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Good to see you all again. And again, you know, if you have any issues with the webinar, just let me know and I'll try to help fix things. Or if you have any comments, feel free to send them in to us at the policy line or to my email as well.
Great, thanks, Heather. Would you like to say a quick hello, John?
Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome back. It's good to have everyone here. And again, just my role with this process is just helping with the drafting of the protocol.
Thanks, John. And Sarah, would you like to say a quick hello?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so just by way of quick reminder, we've got a good number of workgroup members on the call today, so thank you again for joining us. Very quick admin reminder, everybody that's logged in as the workgroup member will be able to speak, so recommend we keep ourselves on mute unless we are speaking. It'll always be good to cut down on the background noise. And again, not to catch workgroup members, sort of not to alarm you, but the plan here is not to invite a good welcome from each of you, but instead, perhaps we can start with a simple roll call. Looks like we have Adam Chambers on the line.
Correct.
Great, thanks, Adam. Great to have you. I did see Ami register. Do we have Ami on the line? Perhaps not quite, but I think Ami's registered, so hopefully we'll pick Ami up in not too distant future, but looks like not quite at the moment. Dan, I don't think Dan was able to make it, but correct me if I'm wrong. Did we catch you today, Dan? Not today. Dawn, I don't think Dawn was able to make it at this point. No, I don't think so.
Dawn
Okay,
is on,
Christian?
Sammy.
Oh, Dawn is on. Okay, welcome, Dawn. Great, thanks, Sarah. Christian, I think Christian was registered, and I think we have Christian's a colleague from Chell as well. Let me see, I'm not sure if we have them on right at this moment, but I think we can expect representatives from Shell's membership on the workgroup to join us shortly. Jacqueline, I do believe we captured you today, Jacqueline, is that right?
That's right. Hello, everybody.
Great, thanks, Jacqueline. Grayson, I think Grayson was registered. Are you on the line at the moment, Grayson?
I am.
Great, thanks for joining us, Grayson. Well, looks like give me one sec, looks like my computer's malfunctioning slightly. That cursor's moving around like got a mind of its own. Give me 1 second. John, we catch John today.
Yeah, how you doing, Sammy? Hey, everyone.
Welcome, thanks, John. Well, thank you. And Justin, I believe we do have Justin on the line.
Hey there.
Thanks for joining us, Justin. Karen, I think we were lucky to catch you today.
Yep, I'm here, and but Dr. Brian McConkey, my chief scientist, is not available today, but he's been working really hard behind the scenes.
Yes, we had some great feedback from Brian that we shared with the work group via the model validation proposed updates. So very good to have you, Karen, and thanks again for the support from Brian. Keith, I don't believe we were able to catch Keith or a member of the CSU team today. I don't think so. Okay. We also received a lot of feedback from Keith and his team that we shared with the work group in respect of the model validation documents, but not in person today. Ken, I think Ken had planned to join, but I don't believe we've captured Ken this morning yet. But hopefully he'll be able to log in a little bit later. Our friends at WRI on the work group, I believe they were also intending to join, but I don't think they've logged in just yet. So hopefully we'll be able to have somebody from WRI join in a little bit later. I think we've got a Max Duberson from Indigo Ag.
Afternoon, everybody.
Welcome, Max. Mitchell Hora, I don't think we've had Mitchell log in yet, and I'm not sure that he was available for today. And Nick, I don't expect that we're going to catch Nick today either based on availability. Patrick, I think we're going to miss Patrick today as well, unfortunately. Robert Parkhurst was able to make it. Hi, Robert.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.
Yeah, welcome, Robert. Good to have you. And Stephen, we did catch Stephen today. Hi, Stephen.
Yep. Hi, everyone.
Thanks for making it, Stephen. And Tom Cannon. I think we did catch you today. Tom, welcome.
Very much. Appreciate it, Sammy.
Yeah, your audio is a bit low, Tom, but we can sort of hear you. But welcome, mate. Very, very good to have you. Tom Stoddard, I think, is registered but not quite on the line yet. So hopefully we'll catch Tom Stoddard in a little bit later today. Bill, did we catch Bill from Delta? I don't think Bill's on the line just yet. Not yet, but hopefully we'll catch him. Okay, so again, very big welcome to all of you. These are unpaid volunteers that are critical to this process, so we very much appreciate that. And thank you all for joining us. And hopefully we'll have a few more work group members join throughout the session a little bit later. Okay, so now we'll go into a little bit of a process overview to remind you of how this webinar fits into the broader process. So a lot of this will be by way of reminder, but just to recap, we kicked off ostensibly these efforts via a scoping meeting back in January 15th. That was back when the world was a little bit of a better, different place, should we say. Feels like quite a while back now. Since then, we convened the work group shortly thereafter. So if you might recall that during that public scoping meeting, we put out a public invitation to anybody who'd like to join us. We've got a very, very generous amount of folks volunteering their time for this. We convened the work group shortly thereafter, and then we proceeded with a number of work group meetings. You can see there, 1, 2, 3. That was followed by our typical 30-day public comment period, which went from April to May. We did also have a public comment meeting, which I forgot to add to that list there, but that was around about mid-April, I believe. And then from there, typically we would respond to public comments in writing and sort of accommodate some of the ideas put forward there, and then we would move the protocol to our board. In this instance, you'll see that we did receive a significant amount of really useful public comments. So we decided it's going to be most appropriate for us to pause, to not take this protocol through to our board for the previously scheduled meeting on June 10th. Instead, we have been engaging heavily with all the parties who provided public comments. We've had a number of discussions now with a good number of you, and hopefully we'll be lining up further discussions. And so today's meeting is not always a feature of our process, but we thought it'd be most appropriate to bring some of those great ideas back to the work group, walk through all of those public comments, as well as some of our thoughts and some specific proposals in response. And then from there, there's no finite dates going forward, but from there, if we need to, we can have another work group meeting, and we can also endeavour to provide a full updated draft of a protocol with significant or sufficient time for the work group to be able to consider it. So perhaps something like 2 weeks, and then from there, at some point, reconvene for another public comment period and another public comment meeting. And then, assuming that all goes well, we don't have specific dates locked in for a board adoption, but we can tell you that the next full board meeting is September 30th. So we can softly aim for that as a target date for when we might be able to bring this protocol to our board. But just to reiterate, these meetings and next steps are largely TBD based on the really useful feedback that we got during the public comment period. Let me just pause for a moment and check. We've got a little bit of feedback. Yeah, there we go. How's that? Somehow my mouse pad seemed to fritz out a bit, but that looks a little bit better, right? Maybe somebody can let me know if it seems to be a little bit.
That looks good.
There we go. A bit better. Okay, thanks for that. Great.
Sammy, this is Adam Chambers, and I would just like to commend you all on slowing down the process a little bit. I think that's a really good call.
Yes, absolutely, Adam. We thank you for that. Obviously, you and all the workgroup members are volunteering your time here. So when we pause, when we invite you in for more meetings, it puts additional constraints on yourselves. But we very much appreciate it and very happy to have you. So thank you. All right. So what you see on this slide here is a summary of all of the commenters. I should note for you all that we do publish all the public comments on our website. So we did that shortly after the end of the public comment period. And just by way of reminder, we typically we always go in and reply formally in writing to all of those public comments. So that is certainly a next step that we will take. But at this point, we're sort of pausing so that we can reach out and engage with each of these entities to make sure that we have the opportunity to fully appreciate each other's perspectives, and then also, maybe talk through substantive means by which we can enshrine that feedback and make this protocol stronger as a result of it. So all the names here are all the folks that generously went through these materials and provided written comments. Just by way of reminder, we will have another public comment period. So all of you on the webinar today are absolutely welcome to submit formal written public comments during that follow-up period. But we will also remind you that we're happy to take any such feedback at any stage during the process. So you can engage with us at any time, and then you can also feel free to engage in just this type of public comments when we open the protocol back up for public comment.
Hey, Sammy.
Yes.
This is Robert Parkhurst. You know, I submitted comments when there was a draft for the working group. And I think it might be, I'd like to have those made public as well. I don't know if other folks in the working group did that and if they're comfortable with doing it, but I think it'd be helpful for the dialogue to have those out there as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Robert. Yes,
I think that'd be a great idea as well. This is Grayson Badgley. I think that'd be really helpful.
Okay, thanks, Grayson. Perhaps what we can do, in all fairness, is to invite workgroup members to perhaps, reach out to us in writing and sort of confirm explicitly exactly which materials they'd like to be available. The reason that might be useful is, we've had a really strong level of engagement with a good number of the workgroup members, many calls, many email exchanges, many exchanges of documents and ideas. So just to be safe, to make sure we're respecting your confidence appropriately, if you can reach out to us and let us know, here's the thoughts that I'd provided previously that I'd like you to put out to the rest of the work group or put out publicly. We can consider that. As a practical step, for instance, one thing we might do is just have you resubmit those during the next public comment period. That could be a way we do it, or just reach out to us and let's engage in dialogue about the most appropriate means that we can make those materials and ideas available to the rest of the group. We can talk through whether it's the work group or more broadly to observers in the public, for instance. Okay, yeah, appreciate those thoughts. So this slide here, this is just a very high level overview of the major topics raised in public comments. So if you, as somebody who submitted a comment and your feedback doesn't happen to fit in on these particular categories, don't worry, we're going to go through, I think, hopefully every single major comment. This is just a sort of a high level summary of what the main categories were, and we're going to walk through not only these but also a lot of those other sort of more subtle points that were raised for some of the other parts of the protocol. So just briefly, there were issues raised with respect to conflict of interest, additionality and performance. It's always a really meaty part of the protocol, and we got some good feedback on that. Baseline setting, greenhouse gas boundary, leakage, always a tricky issue. Quantification, model guidance validation, permanence, always an important part of the discussion, and a lot of feedback on verification. Just down the bottom there, just by way of reminder, all these public comments were posted online upon receipt, and we will be providing a comprehensive summary of the comments as well as our responses in writing, just not quite yet. We're sort of paused in engaging with stakeholders, but we will do that as a next step. So at this point on the following slides, we'll start to run through some of these public comments. And then let me just remind you, all on the work group, you have the ability to speak. And so what we'll do is we'll run through these issues one by one, and we'll pause. We'll do a little bit of an awkward silence to invite work group members to jump in, but feel free to jump in at any point if you'd like to join in the discussion. Very much encourage that. So for this first issue, we'll just hand it over to Craig Ebert, who'd like to say a few words.
Thanks, Sammy. One of the issues that was raised in the public comment process was concerns about a conflict of interest in the overall fairness of the process, because we are undertaking the potential development of the soil enrichment protocol with funding from Indigo Ag. And the argument was posed that does that not pose a potential conflict of interest? And I want to be very clear that we soundly reject that notion. Throughout the reserve's history, the types of protocols we're developing are committed to coming up with the highest level of environmental integrity and market acceptance. I want to stress that issue of market acceptance, both obviously coming up with something that has a high level of environmental integrity should go without saying, but we undertake what we call a standardized baseline approach for all of our offset protocol development here at the Reserve, i.e. we want to make sure that it has the widest applicability in the market. We don't do a single protocol on a project-specific basis. That is an approach that, for example, has been used under the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. While there are many good things that came out of that process, there are a lot of serious issues as well when things, issues around additionality, baseline establishment, et cetera, were being handled on a project-specific basis. So when we talk about adopting a standardized baseline approach, it's trying to make sure that we've got the widest applicability in the market here. So, that's certainly one key takeaway. Also want to note that all of our protocols have been undertaken with external funding. As a small nonprofit, frankly, it's the only way to get a lot of our work undertaken. And I think one other aspect that I want to remind the work group that you are a part of is that we stress a very transparent, public, diverse, stakeholder-driven process. We compose our technical working groups with a diverse set of players and viewpoints. We welcome any and all public stakeholders who are interested in an issue at the table to weigh in on it. At the end of the day, the goal is to achieve the widest understanding of the work that's underway and to allow people to weigh into it as much as possible. As Sammy, I think a lot of you know, we followed up with many of you on this subject, and frankly, we're not hearing from the work group members that they thought this was an issue. But I also want to stress that what is our goal for the intent of the work group? You guys are providing a source of expert technical input, and I don't need to remind you that it's not paid. And by design, it comes from a variety of different sources. We've got academics, scientists, project developers, verifiers. And we're not specifically seeking your endorsement on the protocol. That responsibility is on our shoulders, but I can't express enough how much we appreciate your input on any important matters, including the overall fairness of the process. So each and every one of you should feel like you've had the opportunity to express your viewpoints. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to coalesce around your particular viewpoint, but everybody is listening, and we certainly are listening. And Adam, you mentioned earlier, that we've slowed down the process, and that frankly, that's if you look at the track record of the protocol development efforts that we currently have posted on our website, you'll find that that's the case time and again. Whatever one thinks might be the starting schedule is constantly being revised based on input that we're receiving. So just wanted to provide that as background in case any of you had any questions or concerned about that. One related issue that came up with that was, are there any members of this work group that have worked with Indigo Ag in the past? Fair question. And we typically don't ask ourselves that question, because the work group by design, as I just said, is a combination of players in the carbon offset marketplace. It's not a large world out there in this space, so it wouldn't be surprising to us at all that some of you have worked with each other, including potential funders of our protocols. But in the end, in the interest of just being completely transparent about it, we're providing a summary of those on the work group who have had some financial involvement working with Indigo, and the type of work that they've done is identified there. So I'll leave it to each of you to decide how you feel about that. I will stress that I'm happy to talk to anybody about this issue at any one time. There's probably one entry on here that a lot of people may be scratching their head is, why is Max Duberson as an employee of Indigo Ag being flagged? Max used to be our director of policy here at the Reserve, and Indigo Ag poached him late last year. Now, if anybody thinks that somebody poaching one of my best people is buying influence, I'm happy to have that discussion with you, but they're not. So in any event, as I said, we want to be completely transparent about this. That's why we've disclosed from the very get-go what our funding source is, and we're going to continue to do that. So we thank Indigo for their financial support. They have a voice in this, just as everyone else. We want to make sure at the end of the day that we come out with the highest quality product that has the widest degree of market applicability. So Sammy, back to you.
Thanks, Craig. So as throughout this work group meeting, perhaps this would be a good opportunity to pause and see if there's anybody else on the call that would like to say any words in respect to this particular issue.
Yeah, this is Tom Cannon. If you can hear me, is my audio a little better now?
Yeah, that's much better. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to speak to this a little bit. I am on the board of directors of Indigo Research Partners. Now, that is not the actual board of the company. It is a board group of producers, all producers, that help them target specific research programs and help them kind of manage the research side of Indigo and some of the products that Indigo puts out. We just advise on that. And really, I advise Indigo on how to shape their products and business model, just so that I can have a positive impact on growers. I want to have a positive impact on the environment and on agriculture. I will say this, as I have been in this work group, I'm brutally honest with those that are in the powers that be at Indigo, and I don't receive, I'm not an employee, I don't receive any money for that. But I have a passion for the environment, I have a passion for our land and our creation. And I just felt like I could help with Indigo, make an impact on a larger scale than what I was doing in public speaking engagements. And similarly, I thought I could have an impact, hopefully, on our environment and on this climate change through helping Climate Action Reserve. So I will say this, I'm not being paid, and there's certainly, I see no conflict of interest personally at all in sitting on this work group. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Hello, everyone. This is Robert Parkhurst. And so I also would like to bring up the work that I'm doing with Indigo and in full transparency. So the work I'm doing is related to the low carbon fuel standard. So it is another environmental market, but not directly related to this work, although it does build off some of the work here. My prior comment about making my comments public, when I responded to the working draft, I was not aware that those would not be made public. I have no problem in doing so and encourage people, if they've got questions or concerns of my involvement in the process, to look at the comments and look at them from that standpoint and consider whether or not there's a conflict of interest. I'm also willing to go through any independent conflict of interest review if people feel that that's an issue. I've worked on protocols since 2005 with the Reserve's first forest protocol and ag protocols for 8 years. So I'm hopeful that my thoughts here are constructive to make this a better and stronger protocol. And I'll turn it back there to Sammy with that.
Yeah, hey everyone, it's John Sanderman. I was just gonna, Rob, I actually really appreciated what you said asked earlier about making the comments public. I think that is a way of maybe increasing trust in the group. And so I just wanted to ask Craig and Sammy, are we going to disclose? I mean, I'm totally happy with adding some sort of disclosure, and I feel like that's probably the minimum that we should do in the next draft that comes out. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts, Sammy or Craig, on that.
Thanks. We actually plan. Go ahead. Sorry, Sammy. We do plan to post this information on the website. We can include it in the draft. As I said, the only reason we haven't disclosed it up to now is that we weren't even thinking about this issue. But now that someone has raised it, we're happy to make it available to everybody.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I guess if you're talking about information that each of you listed here and Indigo has shared with respect to potential COI, what we're doing is carefully working with each of you to make sure you're comfortable. You know, it's not necessarily our place to unilaterally put your business out there, but certainly I believe just about all of you at this point have said yes, you feel comfortable, so we can work closely with you to publish that information on our website. And then separately, with respect to feedback that anybody has provided to us, you know, we're careful to delineate between feedback that's received as part of a formal public comment period, which we put you all on notice that we're absolutely publish those openly, and contrast that to feedback that we've received outside of that very discrete window. There's some requests here to perhaps extend that and publish a little bit further information. Certainly, you know, as with the webinar today, our process is open. So even when you indicate you're happy for us to share information, then certainly we can look at the most appropriate means to do so and absolutely make that information available. Just to be clear for everybody else, we won't openly disclose any communications or information you share with us unless we're sure that you're indicating you'd like us to, just to make sure we maintain Chatham House rules whenever it's appropriate to do so.
Hey, Sammy?
Yes.
Let me just clarify, the information we're going to make available is what you're seeing here on the screen. The details of what this engagement involved, you know, we're not going to go there. Frankly, it's not our call. You know, just to use, you know, John Standerman's work as an example, you know, that's a relationship between each individual here and Indigo. I'm sure there's, you know, confidentiality clauses involved, and it's frankly not our purview to worry about what type of soil samples they were analyzing. So we are disclosing the type of work, but beyond that, we're not certainly going to be going into the details because we don't have that.
Thanks, Craig.
Hey, Sammy, it's Karen here.
Yeah, hi, Karen.
Hey, hi. You know, having run you know, these kinds of review and development processes for regulated markets in Canada, I just want to point out that this isn't any different than a lot of the processes we've run up in Canada around the coordination and very open and transparent process that, you know, the market, the community will bring forward the protocol in a way, and then it enters the review process, whether it was coordinated by myself at an NGO in Alberta or collaborative effort with CAR up in Canada, in Ontario and Quebec. This is just very common to have this kind of review process where either, you know, somebody has gone to the trouble of developing a protocol and a methodology and then submitting it to the program and registry to coordinate. So if some of you aren't familiar with that, this is very similar to things that happen in other programs and registries. The difference here is that CAR takes over the process and basically runs it in a very open and transparent way. So I just wanted to make that clear that this process is not different from many, many other processes out there.
Great, thanks, Karen. We do have a comment that came in, a written comment just a moment ago. I won't read out the name, but I'll reflect on that so that we can share those perspectives. There's a question here that basically says, given some people are a little bit worried about bias, should we make the point in the protocol itself about why we think there's no bias, that public perception is really important for how and if the protocol gets used? It's a good question. I can say that typically we don't, but that doesn't mean we can't consider whether we sort of refine the general language that we present, whether it's how we present the work group's role or something like that. So, you know, we've developed, what is it, maybe 22 protocols now. Personally, this is the first time I've seen this issue come up. So our default position would be perhaps not to do that, but certainly we can consider it further and have further input from the whole group as to, you know, whether we enshrine a statement to that effect in the document itself. Okay, well, that was very useful discussion. Not to cut it short, feel free to jump out if you have any further thoughts. Feel free to use the written question or chat box if you'd like to get any thoughts in. As I said again, you'll have our email addresses towards the end if you don't already. And feel free to send us written comments. Otherwise, hearing a little bit of silence in the interest of time, perhaps we can keep the discussion moving and move on to further points. Okay. So a little bit of a messy slide here, so apologies, a little bit of a color coding there. Not sure whose flag's represented here, but this is a high-level summary of proposed changes. So you saw that there were, what was it, maybe 20 people took the time to very generously go through in detail and provide some very thoughtful feedback. This is a high-level summary of a very large number of changes we're making in response. But we're also flagging for you that, hey, we've got this volunteer group of work group members who are continuously providing us great ideas throughout, and hopefully even more today. So we're also reflecting that not only have we made a significant number of edits in response to the very thoughtful public comments, but we're also continually refining this work based on expert feedback from the work group, and then also flagging that the reserve staff is not sitting on our haunches either. We're also unilaterally continuing to reflect on how to improve the work here. So these changes we will go through in detail on the following slides. Okay, the first substantive issue, project definition and ownership. So I don't know that we'll go through every single one in finite detail. We'll just manage time, but let's get into it and see how we go. So first comment, we should expand upon prohibition on clearing native ecosystems to include land use change. And you can see there was a couple of different entities that provided that type of feedback. So just by way of a simple response, in this instance, we are going to be making or proposing some concrete changes. So short answer, yes, we agree. It's very useful feedback. So what we'll do is we'll consider excluding fields where there has been significant land use change. So what might that be? Might be something like changing from cropping to grazing. To be clear, we don't expect there to be a significant number of large shifts in farmer behaviour to that effect, so significant, but nonetheless we can look at some further safeguards to make sure we don't see those broad systemic changes. And just noodling on some thoughts, maybe we'll think about an exception for marginal cropped lands. There might be some significant benefits for the environment if we were to move some of those more peripheral lands out of production. But generally speaking, we hear you, and we're going to look at ways to refine. Let me pause there in case there's thoughts from the work group.
Hey, Sammy, this is Chambers. I guess I'm a little bit confused just by your example. I agree with the comment that clearing native ecosystems and land use changes is probably needs to be prohibited, but the example of change from cropping to grazing is a little bit of a fine resolution land use change, and I guess when I think of land use change, I think of larger things like taking a hypothetical 100-acre cornfield and turning it into 5-acre plots or something like that changes that its working land's productivity profile. Because I guess when you get into cropping systems going to grazing, there are a number of systems that run cattle through a harvested cornfield in the fall or winter, and we wouldn't want to prohibit that, I don't think.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Let me throw out a few thoughts and then pause and see if we can reflect further. So you're absolutely right, and what we've done here is we've conflated some broader discussion into a simple point. So this might be one that we follow up offline and really tease it out. But in essence, we had other parties sort of talking about more of a systemic, broader food security, food supply perspective. and they're sort of saying if we see large scale changes in production, then there could be some leakage concerns there. So generally speaking, we're not doing land use planning. We're not sort of getting in and saying a farmer can't decide to move from 100 acres into numerous 5 acres, or control sort of changes between crops. We allow for fallow, all sorts of things. So we're not wholesale prescribing against that, but we'll try to craft language that just sort of guards against wholesale moves of the kind indicated there, which might cause significant leakage of production elsewhere. It's a complex issue, and summarizing it in the way we have is, perhaps glosses over some of that. But just to be clear, we're not looking at prohibiting individual farmers making decisions. What we will try to reflect on is sort of broader systemic impacts. We do already have what we think is robust leakage mechanisms to account for drops in yield on a field and project level. And we'll talk about that later, but point well received, Adam, and certainly we can follow up in detail to show you our thinking. But I think what we're likely to come up with will not cause the problems that you're raising. But let me stop there.
Yeah, Sammy, this is Tom Cannon. I would like to be a part of that discussion, because really what we're doing is asking people to conduct land use change. We're asking people to become more regenerative. We're asking people to change the way they're doing it. We're asking people, as part of the 5 principles of regenerative ag, to graze cropland. So that really, it's the devil's going to be in the details there, and I'd like to be a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes.
This is Craig. We hear those points. Let me just clarify primarily the WR point. And part of this is a definitional issue. What do we mean by land use change? We didn't. WRI's primary concern was fundamental conversion of native ecosystems to agricultural land. It's an international concern they feel about, do fundamental changes in agricultural practices, one of the leakage effects, lead to the development of more and more agricultural land to feed the global population, and therefore lead to increased deforestation and destructions of other native ecosystems. It's a valid point. If you look at what the IPCC says, in their latest report on climate change and land, that concern is more focused in developing countries where that pressure is acute. They actually go so far as to say that it's less of an issue in the developed world. But you're absolutely right. We need to get the wording correct. But I think we're talking about fundamental leakage shifts here. That's could be leading to other major shifts in how land is utilized, not lands currently in use for agriculture, where there clearly are land use decisions made all the time about what are you going to do with a given plot of land. That's not the intent here.
Yeah, that's right. So again, this is really just a reflection on perhaps poorly drafted slides. Rather than 1,000 slides for each individual point, we've sort of collated them together. This example is a bit of a rough one where the messaging is a bit off. But for instance, we have a colleague from Ducks Unlimited who are clarifying their point. What they're sort of saying is, well, we're saying things, the protocol currently talks about native ecosystems, but we'd also not want to see lands coming out of the CRP, sort of restored grasslands, suddenly being put into intensive agriculture. So yeah, we've sort of conflated those broader concerns from WRI here with more finite thoughts put forward by Ducks Unlimited, which perhaps better classified as just broad, the term native ecosystem to be a little bit broader to, incorporate other conserved lands. All right, well, that's one where perhaps we'll make sure we flag for you those changes in the document itself when it comes out, and you'll be able to look in at that and see that hopefully we haven't, thrown the baby out with the bathwater. It's certainly not the intent here. And we'll move on to the next comment. So let's see. Add eligibility for a range of other practices. Some good examples there: composting, biosolids, agroforestry. A number of stakeholders put forward similar views. So yes, we think that's good feedback, and certainly we'll go in and see if we can tweak the guidance in a couple of spots in the protocol, up the front in the project description, but also in the back in the appendix. There are a couple of spots where what we try to do is give an indication of the types of changes that are likely to be moving in the right direction. They're likely to have great positive impacts, and then we offer examples. So we can go in and sort of clarify and offer more examples. But the general message is most of these activities that are mentioned will be eligible, and that'll be a function of whether we have default equations and emission factors available, and also whether the tool, the model that's chosen by the given project developer happens to be able to accommodate some of those changes. And I can tell you composting, biosolids, very high likelihood they will be included, but agroforestry at this point will not be included. Simple response there is that the primary focus was on a lot of these other cropping opportunities. The tools available were able to accommodate those. With agroforestry, unfortunately, it would probably require us to go in and build out a bit more sophisticated accounting for forestry, similar to we would on a forest project, where probably sent the humans out there to take measurements, etc. At this point, in the interest of time, we've focused in on the cropping. We certainly can come back in later and expand it further to things like agroforestry. We pause there to see if there are any thoughts from the other members.
Sandy, it's Karen here. Obviously, in terms of legitimate accounting, if those organic amendments are going on to the soils in the project, they couldn't have been put on land traditionally in the baseline anywhere, right? So things like ICI waste, human biosolids, diverted from landfill sorts of stuff is, I think, fair game, because they don't typically go on to agricultural land. So we just can't be doing that moving carbon around thing. And so there has to be some stuff written in those organic amendments around clarity.
Yes, the moment we try to mention something as a simple input, it gets more and more complex. You're absolutely right. There are all sorts of peripheral issues, and in fact, the following slides do talk about some of those, which maybe we'll characterize as, well, what about associated fuller life cycle assessments of what's happening when we move it from over there to over here. So we'll speak about that in a moment. And then there might also be some regulatory constraints. Generally speaking, we know, hopefully we're all clear now, that what we'll do is we'll require a comprehensive accounting for what happened in the baseline. So let's just simplify things. If you were putting 5 units of compost in the baseline and you move to 10 units in the project, that would be a change that would be captured using the quantification methods that we have. And then, you'll be able to potentially capture GHG impacts associated with those changes. So baseline mechanisms will capture what happened previously. Regulations might prevent anything too funky from going on the field. And then there'll also be some broader GHG accounting boundary issues, which we will touch on in following slides. But absolutely, Karen, certainly there are a lot of related issues here. Right, it's great discussion, exactly what we need. I might move on to the next comment, but as again, fire off written thoughts at any time. Feel free to jump in verbally to bring us back at any time. Last comment there, should require at least some basic acknowledgement from the landowner. So we've cited Ducks Unlimited because this was part of their written feedback, but we did get similar thoughts from various folks, including observers, professional project developer observers throughout the process. So this is a theme that has popped up a couple of times. Yes, we think that we certainly can do a better job at providing guidance. And in fact, I think it's already drafted in there, where we will openly encourage project developers to include land title holders in the relevant contracts. And we think we're absolutely agreed to do so would mitigate the risks for those project developers and for the reserve. Just to reflect a little bit back on the rationale for why we haven't made that absolutely mandatory. We received feedback from a number of members, including workgroup parties, that anecdotally, something like mandating land title holders be identified and included in every single field, in every single contract, could actually be quite burdensome, and it could actually be information that's hard to find and therefore resource intensive. And we had anecdotal evidence that on some previous efforts in another registry, other project, that it was one of, if not the biggest cost component of the protocol. So we heard that feedback and we tried to craft this carefully to not mandate it, but we hear you, and we're absolutely going to openly encourage that parties go out there and do it to mitigate risk. Let me pause there. Okay, move on to the next slide. Oh, easy one, this one. Performance standard, additionality, crediting period, related. There are also issues with respect to how we set the baseline that are closely related, but let's try to tease them out and see if we can generate some discussion here. So we had a number of very well informed stakeholders. You can see there that put a comment out. Is a single practice change enough? Should we consider requiring multiple changes, or you should consider requiring multiple changes? A little bit by way of reserve thinking, and then I think we'll stop to see if folks would like to get into a discussion. But in essence, what we're hearing from our agronomists that are providing input, as well as from literature that we've reviewed, that single practice adoption is going to be the safest for farmers. So practically speaking, it's probably going to be safest for the farmers themselves if we coax them into picking up one new practice, and then over time, openly encourage them to move towards a bit more of a broader systems approach. So certainly, as we start to see farmers stacking on more and more of these complementary practices, that will be the safest way to move towards a new system. But if we were to encourage farmers to go for a rather drastic change all at once and embrace 10 new practices at once, it could be quite risky for the farmers themselves. It also might be worth focusing on what might be a little bit of a misnomer. What the agronomists are also telling us is that most likely there will be multiple subtle changes happening at once. Several work group members have also pointed that out. So even though it might be most obvious to focus in on one and to see that there's quite clearly been a change in respect to one, most likely there are going to be a number of other subtle changes which are occurring at the same time. And we certainly think that bundling multiple practices together, especially over broad geographical scale, is actually going to be quite critical for project feasibility. So we don't think there are going to be projects out there that are rolling in significant emission reductions with just the adoption of one practice. We think that there's going to be bundling, and we think it's going to happen relatively quickly within the first few years, indeed. But let me pause there. So I think this is quite an important issue. Let's see if folks want to get into some discussion.
Yeah, Sammy, this is Mitchell Hora from Iowa. And I definitely like the response here on keeping it broad and open, in that we know that it's going to take multiple practices being adopted to be able to really move the needle and see change. And as the farmers then evaluate their additionalities in soil carbon as the testing process occurs, they will be able to see if that single change or maybe just a couple changes is enough to make it worth it for them. And what I think will happen here, and where I think there's opportunity for maybe people listening on or just other researchers going forward, is what is the cost of that change in practice versus the reward in terms of the carbon payment? And where is that balance in terms of a farmer being able to see a return on investment to be able to help to offset some of those costs of those change in practices? I think that will help to encourage faster adoption, more widespread adoption, and because as those farmers chase large payments for their carbon sequestered.
Yeah, I would like to piggyback a little bit there with Mitchell. I agree with exactly what he said. As a producer, trying to go into an unknown can be scary. And on the emotional side of things, considering one practice or maybe two as a way to, put your toes in the water, so to speak, is a great idea. Also, I agree with what Mitchell said. They're going to be looking at the ROI on adopting this practice versus what, you know, the ROI on their climate payments, or their carbon payments, I should say. The thing is, what they will quickly realize, probably very quickly, is the benefits to resiliency of their soils and the added income that they can have through increased yields. So I agree. I think that trying to bundle as a startup in the first years would be very scary for a lot of farmers. I think there would be an emotional kickback to trying to adopt many new practices up front.
Yeah,
Great,
this is Adam
thanks.
Chambers. I guess I'll just build on that as well. And, you know, then you get into kind of, if you are doing the modeling piece, you get into, you know, modeling, and then you open up uncertainty, and you go down a whole pathway. If you're bundling a whole bunch of things, it's not only like the farmer's perspective and the, you know, let's start small, let's start with one thing, and then we'll pile on a second, and then maybe a third. But trying also to then quantify that and model that, you open up kind of a whole level of complexity that, you know, sometimes we don't have all the answers yet as a scientific community. So I guess, you know, to build on the discussion, we've gone kind of from the farmer to the quantification challenges, and I would just say, let's start small and simple.
I'll add on to Adam's comments there. This is Robert. I think that, you know, any practices that people do want to take, and I encourage farmers to undertake as many practices and them combined as possible, but I do think we need to have scientific support for doing that. If you're going to run the model, you need to have the science that supports that the practice does have a positive change, and that the combination of practices have the benefit of the change. So both of those need to be there. And so I'll echo this again when we get into quantification and other parts, but we need to have that science to make sure what we're doing, we actually have some level of certainty on.
Great, thanks for those perspectives. So just to recap, Tom and Mitchell are both producers, so they're actual farmers, and then we've got Adam Chambers coming from NRCS, Robert Parkhurst, long-standing advocate in this space, so good broad spectrum of views. Not to cut the discussion short, but I might reach out. We've got some folks, you know, in the observer field who are offering some thoughts, so I might just reflect on a couple of those. They've asked if we can sort of hand the mic over. Let me just perhaps paraphrase at this point, and we can consider doing that later, but I think with a group of this size, it might get a little bit unwieldy if we start handing the mic over. But let me reflect on some of those thoughts. So good question here, that should we require additional practices for accrediting period renewal? In other words, if we allow farmers to dip their toe in with one activity, can we perhaps put some sort of a time limit on when they must do the next activity, and maybe the crediting period renewal might be a safe point to do it? Just to remind folks, we'll get into that a little bit later, but that'll probably equate to something like a 10-year period. Certainly that's something that we've discussed openly at the reserve since receiving your public comments in this area, and that is one thought that we put out there. Sure, something like a 10-year period certainly seems like a safe point at which we could require that type of stacking. So that is an idea that we're considering. Okay, so there are going to be a number of similar thoughts here, so perhaps we'll keep moving, but we're sticking with the theme of additionality, and we'll also touch on crediting periods specifically, so the general discussion can keep going, but perhaps I'll move to that second point now. So the protocol should consider a common practice or a regional performance standard type evaluation. You can see that there's you know, some very well-reasoned ideas from well-respected parties there. Let me put it to you this way, that's certainly our starting position at the reserve. That's what we tended to do. We look for a common practice assessment as maybe, you know, the first point that our thoughts go to. So certainly coming into this exercise, we thought just that. But then we reflected on, you know, a lot of the literature that we have referenced in the appendix on the PST, and it seemed to suggest that something a little bit different might be more useful here. So that's kind of why we pivoted away from that. But just looking at what's written on the slide here, if we were to look at a common practice assessment, and we did, there could be some challenges that sort of present themselves, or they always present themselves, but particularly acute here. So data availability is an obvious one. You know, we've built a number of protocols in this area, and data availability always jumps out. At the end of the day, it would circumscribe the number of different combinations of activities, crops, parts of the country that we would have sufficient data for to be able to build it. So we would go from what we have now, which is, let's let the farmers and project developers decide what range of practices and where, to something which would be much more restrictive. So it might end up being a couple of practices over here in Iowa and a few over there and 2 or 3 over here. So the result will be much more piecemeal. And we think that that would be, you know, present also challenges with respect to feasibility in terms of the projects themselves. We know that there was some great work in Alberta done that was very successful. Apart from that, it's still proving to be quite tricky to bundle together enough farmers in different parts with different activities to make the projects feasible. So real challenge here. And then the last point there is to reflect on some of the work from our peers. So not sure if you've all seen it, but Vero or VCS program recently had a public comment webinar where they put forward an effort that they're considering very similar to this, which was also most of the key inputs provided by Indigo and other technical partners. And in that exercise, they sort of highlighted what they're considering, which in essence is you know, similar to this. It's a newer kind of additionality assessment. In their piece, they do have a common practice assessment, but it's different from what we see in, you know, in industrial settings in the past. Common practice is a much higher threshold, looking at sort of the preponderance of activity in a given area. They're also focusing in on combined practices. So it's a common practice of a combination of practices, not a single practice, and also at large geographical scale. So in that particular protocol, the idea that's currently out for public comment is that we would do an assessment and the project as a whole. So if you have a project that covers large regions, we would take that large area as a whole and look at common practice and look at common practice across the broad suite of practices. So what we're seeing is, you know, we have our peers that are also considering whether it's appropriate to move towards something that's a little bit different from an industrial application to, you know, something that might better fit what we're seeing in the ag sector. But again, let me pause there to see if there are other points that people would like to raise, other points.
So Sammy,
oh, go ahead.
So Sammy, I'm not sure I completely follow you. I think I heard you say that you're looking for the common practice at the combination of practices. And I would agree that if you're trying to look at cover crop and no-till and reduced nitrogen use all in one field or one county or one region, that would be difficult. And I think that's actually what we need to do when we're looking at the model and the practices. But for an additionality, couldn't you use information like NAS or some others to show that it's not common? I mean, you know, some of the research that I've done recently shows that the uptake of a lot of these programs, like, you know, EQIP and CRP and CSP are very low. And pointing to those, I mean, you can get them at least at the state level. And Adam, you may be able to answer this if you can get it at the county level, but that could at least get you down on a practice by practice basis of how much it's happened. It gets far more complicated if you're doing combination of practices, but at least for the threshold additionality, I'd be comfortable. I think we need to have an additionality requirement based on data that's out there. And I think we can do that with USDA data.
This is Grayson Badgley. I echo that sentiment. I think that the USDA does a lot of monitoring of a lot of these things, and we ought to be able to do at least a little bit better. I think that this idea of not having a common practice really does challenge the very idea of additionality. And there is data out there. It might not be the greatest, but I think we really need to take a solid look at what there is available and at least make an honest effort. It's not to say it's going to be easy, but I think that the current standard seems to just really fall short of what the core concept of additionality is.
This is Mitchell Hoare again. Some of the feedback that I've gotten on like just kind of regional data and regional like baseline and stuff is more so as a lot of these farms are tested for their baseline, then you can evaluate regional trends to be able to establish the baseline that way based on the data, based on the soil carbon data from the dry combustion analysis, rather than evaluating that regional baseline from the practices. And that would be able to evaluate, you know, a farmer who has already been doing some of these practices would trend much higher than that local average. And that would be a way to be able to better establish progress that had already been made based on previous adoption of new conservation practices in correlation to more of a group or regionalized data set based on climate and soil factors.
Yeah, there's certainly some really useful feedback there. So just to be clear, this obviously is a critical part of the protocol. So it's an area where we're continuing to focus our thoughts and efforts. So we hear you and we really appreciate the feedback. And I think we're most likely continuing to engage with a good number of you on seeing if and what changes could be useful with respect to the performance standard additionality piece. There are a couple of other additionality related pieces on following slides as well, but let's pause to see if anybody wanted to continue this specific discussion.
Yeah, Sammy, it's John. I was just going to add, I mean, I really like the idea of using NAS data, but that limits us to the United States. And I guess if this protocol is going to be broader, we have to think about what data can be available, I guess, everywhere that a project might be implemented. And to Mitchell's point, I've read discussion several years ago about using soil carbon as kind of the basis for additionality, but I think one of the problems is there's just some farmers are just lucky that they're on more fertile land in a region, and there's just so much natural heterogeneity in soil carbon that I feel like you just, I guess my personal opinion is you just can't base it on what you currently have, given that there's anywhere from 20 to 50% variation, even within some really small geography. And so some people's land is just more fertile than others, and so you shouldn't be penalized because you already have good land.
Hi, this is Max. I would also be hesitant to move additionality to be based on the soil carbon, because I worry about properties that, you know, based on their history may have been on a downward trajectory, and, you know, through this protocol could change their practices and slow or hopefully reverse that decline by protecting the carbon and then building it up. But in the early years, they probably wouldn't look very additional, perhaps compared to some of their neighbors, even though they may be taking steps and actually having carbon benefits above and beyond.
Yeah, it's a good broad set of diverse and very useful feedback there. So let me put it this way: this is an area where obviously we're going to have a lot of ongoing focus, and you can expect us to perhaps reach out to some of you and you know, continue that discussion and see if there are changes that we can put into the protocol. If there are no further points at this point, I might move the slide forward, just noting that there will be other points where we touch on additionality on the further slides as well. Okay. In fact, here are some more. Oh, next comment. Is a 30-year crediting period appropriate? Just close this GUI out of the way. For example, allowing the baseline to be valid for 30 years, consider shorter periods. Yep, good feedback. And here's an instance where, yes, we think you're right, we agree, and we will be moving away from one solid 30-year crediting period to a 10-year crediting period with a reevaluation after each 10 years and then optional 2 more crediting periods. That's certainly much more in line with most of our existing protocols. So that's a change that we think we can make and not interfere with a lot of those issues that we discussed earlier. So let me pause there if there are any thoughts, otherwise we'll move to the next one. Okay, next comment. What about including evaluation of financial feasibility to demonstrate additionality? So a moment ago, we talked about common practice component. What we know is that quite often financial feasibility assessments are also a part of a broader suite of additionality checks. So the comment here is, well, what about that piece? Can we, or why not include something like that? Generally speaking, we think a financial additionality test might not be particularly useful in the ag sector. And there's a little bit by way of rationale there, and we can throw it open to the floor. So just thinking it through, it might result in probably similar to where we are now, where just about every practice that we're talking about would conceivably pass, as most practices will be requiring the farmer to go out there and expend resources in changing their system, maybe buying or renting new equipment, different type of tillage equipment, for instance. And most of those practices would not immediately reduce inputs or costs or immediately raise production either. So this type of assessment might sort of land us in a similar position somewhat to where we are now. And we would also expect that type of assessment quite possibly to result in the exclusion of something like nitrogen use efficiency. So nitrogen use efficiency is basically, if a farmer's applying 100 units and strictly speaking they only need 80, well then if they reduce it to somewhere near 80, they're going to immediately be saving money. And so that would quite possibly fail this type of additionality test. Nonetheless, we know that there are pockets around the country where there is still significant over-application of fertilizer relative to what we're being told is the strict need. So this could, potentially perversely exclude things that we all think probably should be a focus of this type of effort, and maybe not exclude a number of other things that people might want to perhaps look to exclude. But let me pause there and see if there's any further thoughts from the audience. Let me just check the question box. I don't think we'll commit to answering questions on the spot each time, but it might make sense in certain instances. Okay.
Hey, Sammy, this is Max. I agree with the thinking you've outlined here on the slide. I feel like the additionality appendix right now lays out pretty well, how financial additionality relates to these ag practice changes.
Right. So one thing I didn't do is reflect back on what we do have. What we do have at present is a bit more of a sort of a broader look at a barriers analysis. A barriers analysis is quite typical in offset protocols as well. Usually perhaps joined together with one or more of these other ideas, like a barriers as well as a financial or a barriers as well as common practice. What we have is primarily a broad barriers analysis, which sort of points to a number of key influences that might sort of weigh in on a farmer's decision-making process, and just sort of pointing out that it's typically not just one decision. It's not simply, you're in the factory and you just flick that switch, you're going to make money, so you go ahead and flick it. There's usually a whole range of complex factors that weigh in. So,
Sammy, it's Karen here. Having worked for an agricultural department for 15 years of my life, and working on extending, adoption of reduced tillage and no-till with growers, the experience we have is that it probably takes almost 5 years to really optimize the adoption of a no-till system. It's a steep learning curve for a grower to be able to think about how to work the no-till system in their crop rotation cycles, how to work the no-till system with the rotation of crop protectants within, because you're not using tillage to control weeds. And so it is a significant adoption curve to get it optimized. And in the short term, until they get that optimized, and the average is a 5-year window, there will be less than stellar yields at times. And it depends on the geographic conditions and the moisture conditions and everything else. In cooler, more northern regions, right, with delays in spring seeding because the soil temperature isn't right. So I agree with your statements completely.
Okay, thanks for that, Karen. So yeah, just to recap, what we're sort of pointing at is that folks on the agronomy side are telling us that quite often something like no-till might actually be the safest way for a farmer to dip their toe in the water. Why? Because those ideas have been promulgated by our friends, for instance, Adam and his team at NRCS for maybe since the 80s. So it could be a safe way for a farmer to sort of move towards this way of thinking. It's something they've seen before, they've heard about it, they might have some neighbors that have done it, might not have reached a tipping point where they're ready to sort of embrace it wholly, but it could be a safe way to dip their toe in, and then from there start to tweak the timing, the rates of application, and hopefully start to bundle together a number of these other practices. And then we need to contrast that from the words of wisdom coming from all of you today with respect to additionality, that typically we do more with respect to additionality. We look at common practice rates. So the key challenge for us here is how do we balance that? How do we safely bring farmers in while paying homage to what would more typically be an approach to additionality? So we will continue to look closely at this and certainly work with you all on crafting an appropriate balance there. Let me pause and see if anybody else wants to jump in from any more thoughts specifically on additionality. All right. And again, reach out anytime via the chat function, question function, emails, phone calls. This is a critical part of the protocol, so we need to make sure that we are able to be as best informed as we can be on taking this part forward. So very, very welcome the discussion. Thank you for that. All right, well, that was easy. So let's move on to some of the other subjects. Baseline, another simple one, no doubt. Let's see. Baseline look-back period approach may not be appropriate for newly cultivated lands or transitioning crop types. Again, we're sort of abbreviating the comment here, so some of the subtlety might get lost. But so just by way of feedback, we talked about already that we're not envisaging massive scale changes of a 100-acre farm moving from intensive cropping to doing nothing, and that activity change sort of bleeds over somewhere else and there's leakage. We're expecting much more subtle combinations of all sorts of things, and then that type of movement from conserved lands to heavily cultivated is not what we're envisaging, and we have some safeguards to make that clear that we don't want that to happen. But generally speaking, it's going to be a bit more of a spectrum. Let's see, and we think it will be more accurate to model the actual historical practices than a counterfactual representation of current practices. That sounds like complex gobbledygook, but let me see if I can step back and sort of try to explain a bit more what we mean here. So I think the question was, trying to get into a specific scenario. If you've got an orchard and suddenly they've moved to growing winter wheat, then you should be comparing the orchard without winter wheat to the orchard with winter wheat. And if there's changes in cropping, you need to think carefully about whether we pretend they were growing the new crop in the baseline and that's more accurate, or do we just keep what they were actually doing in the baseline, whatever it is, and compare it to the new scenario. I don't think there's any perfect approach, and we definitely explored both. I think those of you who've watched this closely know that we've moved through various iterations of baseline approaches. Where we've landed now is we think it'll be most accurate to stick with what actually occurred in the baseline and then compare that to what's happening in the project scenario, even if it is a bit more of a change in those core components. And interestingly, we received some feedback from public commenters that they were encouraging us to explore a kind of emerging field which looks at more of an opportunity cost style analysis. So really trying to get a sense of, can we help point out to farmers where those types of core decisions, that they're able to see the impacts of moving substantially from one type of a crop to a completely different type. And we think this type of baseline approach is more accurate, and it'll also help inform farmers about some of those potential changes from one type of crop to a completely different type of crop. So let me stop there. That issue is a little bit complex, so it might be hard to sort of explain it in these slides, but let me see if there's any thoughts at this point.
Hey, Sammy, this is Adam. I'll jump in on this one and try to just get some clarity on one piece of your example, and maybe it's just the example. So in the moving from an orchard, let's say, or a vineyard that has a woody biomass system that's, not a permanent woody biomass system by any means, but is replaced on I don't know, a decadal or more time frame, but not every 100 years. To kind of winter wheat cropping system, as you mentioned, that one confuses me. I will be honest with you. I mean, if you're moving from cropping system to cropping system, but if you're moving from kind of this heavy biomass, intensive kind of approach to a row crop, that really does kind of confuse that look back period, because it's grapes versus wheat, right? It's apples versus oranges. And so that piece of it actually has me a little bit confused. Everything else I think is okay, but your example just I got confused on. Sorry. Maybe you could explain a little more.
Don't apologise. It was a poor example. Not clever enough to think on my feet to throw a better example out there. Maybe need a bit more sleep. Not clever enough. So I think that the protocol actually talks about not having significant drops in woody biomass, or certainly we had that at one point. What we don't want to see is all sorts of woody biomass being bulldozed and a significant loss of carbon in that respect. So we don't expect it to go that way. But let's use a more subtle example. If it was to go from strawberries to wheat, what we would do in our baseline approach, and we'll, you'll see it in the updated draft when we get it to you, is we would compare strawberries to wheat. We wouldn't compare a hypothetical wheat to the current growing of wheat. We did think about that carefully, and we've been over it a number of times with a range of workgroup members. We think that will be more accurate, and we'll capture the actual changes that are happening. And in fact, we'll be continuing modeling over a 30-year period. So really what we'll be doing is making sure the modeling effort stays consistent with what's actually happening. So it'll be much more accurate, even though it's conceptually a little bit jarring that we're going to be comparing, one type of crop with a different type of crop. So let me pause there. Hopefully that at least made the intent a little clearer. If not, yeah, let me stop there.
Yeah, you clarified that for me. Thanks. Now I'm with you, and I think I guess I support reality versus hypotheticals in that way. So I agree with you.
Yeah, let me just throw out another quick couple of thoughts. If I'm ever paraphrasing and it just sounds like gobbledygook, what you can also do is we've referenced the specific public comments here where relevant. So you can also just go back in there and see, you know, has this guy lost his mind? What did it actually say? And you can get much more, you know, the full public comments are published. So where it's a matter of, you know, me poorly paraphrasing, you can go in and clarify yourself. And then at that point, clearly you can reach out to us again if you want to talk things through. So just throw that out there as a thought. Let me pause and take a look at the questions to see if there are any that might be particularly useful to throw up now while we throw the mic out to the rest of the group. Oof, I got a tough one. Let me see, do I want to get into that or is that going to be too tricky? Let me read it out at least while I reflect on it. How does looking at actual past practices square with Reserve's position on not wanting to reward laggards? It's a tough one. So the baseline will essentially lock in the actual practices that were occurring. So if somebody was quote unquote a laggard, then their historical practices should reflect, you know, plateauing soil carbon or perhaps declining soil carbon or soil carbon that's only creeping up slowly relative to their neighbors to a, you know, got a halo surrounding them, and they're doing a job that's, you know, resulting in more soil organic carbon buildup. So sticking to a historically accurate baseline will in essence lock in those historical behaviors, and the farmer will then only be rewarded or issued offsets for the delta between whatever that was and whatever's coming next. So we think this type of weird reflection on actual practices will in fact enshrine a bit more of a line in the sand between historical and the delta. Let me stop there.
Sammy, I'm a little confused now because you were talking about before about giving credit, recognizing credit for people that had high soil carbon, you know, much as you did in like the avoiding forced conversion protocol. So if you have high carbon and you get credit for it, but then if you have low carbon, you know, if you're a laggard, like it seems like it seems like you're playing both sides of it. Is that you're rewarding people that have done stuff and you're rewarding people that haven't done stuff. Am I following you correctly?
I think that might have been in reference to a comment Max made. So to clarify, we are not handing out a bunch of credits at the start for work that people did well before the start date. Credits will only be issued for a delta between what happened in the historical period and what happens since the start date.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, no worries.
Hey, Sammy, it's John. I'm not sure. I'll have to look at the full evergreen carbon comment, but I guess I might I might be agreeing with them that if something went into cultivation even 10 years ago or even 20 years ago, it could be still in this we talked about earlier, this downward trajectory. And so the businesses, and it's really hard to model that without all of that historic information. So the business as usual would be a continued downward trend, which we should try to be crediting against. And so I'm not sure if this comment was trying to get at that, but this idea that the baseline can be still actively losing carbon and these farmers are trying to mitigate against that further loss.
Yeah, that's right. So to clarify, we would try to capture that historical downward trend and then only credit for a delta that's different from that any existing historical downward trend. That's absolutely what we're doing. So I need to reflect back on the full comment as well, but maybe what it was saying is, well, ideally you want to model back 1,000 years to capture a much longer historical trend, and that's going to be better, quite possibly. But that's putting words into their mouths. I need to reflect back on the comment. But to clarify, we will look back to a historical period. We will capture a direct sample as well as looking at a trend based on modeled results over time. And we carry that trend forward for 30 years. And so if there was historical downward trend. That's the baseline against which they'll be measured. If there was a historical upward trend, that would also be the delta against which, the starting point against which the delta will be measured. This might be an instance where my efforts are just sort of falling well short of adding clarity and sort of clouding the waters. The old Sun Tzu's Art of War. So I recommend anybody who is a little bit confused by my poor efforts here to take a good look at the Evergreen Carbon comment. We will also be releasing an updated draft, so you can take a look at the baseline approach, and then you'll see, perhaps a better idea of what we're doing. And then, maybe at that point we can reconvene and see if there are specific further issues with respect to the baseline approach we want to talk through and tease out. Let's chalk that down to not quite a concise job on my part. All right, not hearing any more comments at this point. Perhaps we can move forward. Okay. Greenhouse gas assessment boundary. So we touched on this a little bit before. One of the points that Karen raised, for instance. So let's revisit. So this first comment: consider fossil fuel emissions associated with production of inorganic nitrogen fertilizers, and we bundle that together with second. Consider fossil fuel emissions associated with manure production and transport. So yes, absolutely, we do consider such potential greenhouse gas impacts with respect to the project. So maybe to start with, let's step back and reflect on how we generally approach these issues. First of all, what we're really looking at is if there's a delta between what happened before and what we foreseeably see as a result of the project. So if there was application of manure or other types of elements in the baseline, it would only be the change from that to the project that we capture. And in this particular instance, speaking through with all of these stakeholders, what we think is we do not anticipate significant changes in the production of inorganic fertilizers or even the movement of those high-value inputs as a result of the project itself. And in such instances, if we don't think there's going to be a massive wholesale change towards people trucking manure all over the country as a result of the project, then it might be reasonable to exclude those types of sources. Let's say that we were convinced otherwise, then there might also be some practical challenges. We might ask ourselves, well, how exactly shall we try to identify or police this? What sort of evidence would we ask for? What would a verifier do in order to confirm it? Did they move it from Charlie's farm 3 farms over? What sort of practical steps would we want to take? And maybe I'll throw out one further thought before we pause. If there is a significant increase in the amount of organic fertilizer, wouldn't ipso facto mean that there's a correlated significant decrease in synthetic inputs? And we're certainly not going to credit for displaced fossil fuel emissions associated with synthetic input decreases. So perhaps that sort of contributes to this broader sense that, we don't think that there's going to be a significant movement of the needle here relative to those parts of the protocol where we think there will be significant impacts. Let me pause there and see if the group has thoughts.
So my interpretation of this is not at a macro level, but more at a micro level if on my farm I was reducing my synthetic nitrogen inputs, the fossil fuel needed to produce those inputs, whether that be, a anhydrous or urea or, UAN or whatever nitrogen fertilizer, is very intensive in the fossil fuels needed to produce that fertilizer itself. So if I'm using less fertilizer, it would directly reduce the need for some of those fossil fuels and emissions to directly take me from utilizing 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. There would be a direct reduction right there, I believe is what they're getting at. And then in conjunction to that, like if I'm going to use manure, some manure equipment utilizes much larger equipment and much more horsepower and equipment and transportation equipment versus smaller bulk synthetic fertilizer. So I think that's what they're getting at, and just direct what is the current emission per ton of nitrogen produced versus current emission from the equipment for the tons of fertilizer spread. I would also then argue to that point, if we're going to look at not only the actual impact on the soil carbon itself, but more holistically in terms of the supply chain components of that net emission, that then we should also look at, as I'm reducing tillage, I'm reducing that tractor's emissions into the atmosphere as well, or that tractor burning diesel fuel and the carbon impact of that. Not only the loss in, or the delta in the loss of carbon based on changing the act of the actual tillage itself. So by reducing tillage, yes, I'm holding more carbon in my soil, but I'm also reducing my emissions through that tractor or through the supply chain of building up, that machinery and such. So I think there is an argument here, but it does open up kind of a new can of worms to go beyond the soil carbon itself and into a more holistic approach. I do think it needs to be factored in at some point here because it is critical, and I think it really adds up. But I'm not sure if it needs to be addressed in this for today's discussions.
Let me just throw out some quick thoughts in response to that, because you raised some really good issues that clarifying, and then let me pause and let the rest of the group speak. So well characterized. So to clarify, we do require projects to account for those on-field impacts. So if you are making changes in terms of how much you're running your tractor and how much fossil fuels you're burning to run your equipment around, that will definitely be captured. And then just trying to think how you characterize it, the supply chain issues. So really we draw the boundary, around the farm itself. So those on-farm changes will capture, and it's those broader supply chain impacts we don't capture based on our thinking that it's not going to be significant change. In other words, we don't think there's going to be 1,000 trucks rolling down the road with manure, and we don't think there's going to be a factory that produces fertilizer closing, synthetic fertilizer closing. So it's those supply chain issues that are typically excluded in an offset protocol, but certainly, as you pointed out, there will be immediate on-farm impacts, such as rolling equipment around and those changes. Those we will capture. So I just wanted to clarify that point, and that was a great issue. Let me stop there.
Sammy, it's Karen here. The only thing I could think of that we had encountered up in Alberta during protocol development was if the opportunity is to increase continuous cropping and reduce summer fallow. We had to go through an exercise that in a geographic region, if the percentage of summer fallow was reduced as you move to more continuous cropping and conservation cropping, the calculation in the area of residual summer fallow and the fact that you would now be adding more nitrogen fertilizer, we had to bring in the embedded emissions in the fertilizer upstream in that case, because you're reducing summer fallow, you're going to continuous cropping, you're increasing more synthetic N. And so we had to do that geographical region of what could happen if you did reduce summer fallow. That's just an example, but I have a hard time. I'm kind of with the previous speaker, like I don't think you're going to see increase of nitrogen as a rule. It will be a decrease, if anything, as people get optimized under this protocol. So, or even add like enhanced efficiency sources along with their nitrogen fertilizer, as those technologies are now available to growers. So it's just that one case we had to bring those embedded emissions into the accounting.
Karen, I might follow up with you afterwards to try to get more information on that. That sounds quite interesting. So I'll shoot you an email afterwards and see if we can get more insights from you on that. I appreciate that.
And I think that raises a really important distinction between baseline emissions and project emissions. That with baseline emissions, we have to worry far more about the boundary and the ownership of those emission reductions and the causal link between the project. Whereas with project emissions, we can be conservative and have a broader boundary if it's appropriate and significant.
Great, thanks, folks. I think there might have been maybe at least one other person that was about to speak earlier when I jumped in. Did everybody who wanted to put in some thoughts get a chance to?
That was me. Thanks, Sammy.
Oh, that was you? Oh, don't worry about that. Okay, we'll pause a moment while I scan the questions, but it's been some good discussion. I think the bottom issue is actually closely related. Let me take a look. Incomplete accounting for offsite impacts of soil amendments. For instance, manure has a limited global supply, shifting crop residues even, which may have been used for animal feed. But you'll see, look, the response there is very high level and similar, where we focus very much on the on-farm impacts, and some of those broader supply chain impacts are typically excluded. Karen gave us an example where there might be an exception to that was considered, but generally speaking, we're not looking at how much it takes to build a new factory or trucking commodities across the country. We're typically focused more at the on-farm impacts. Not to say we ignored it, but we think the impacts are likely to not raise the level of being significant relative to those on-farm impacts. Let me pause there and see if there are other thoughts. And I think there's one more issue on the following slide, which is somewhat related in terms of, well, it's definitely a accounting boundary issue, but let me pause there for a sec. Yeah, it is a pretty similar issue. Okay.
Jimmy, it's Robert.
Hey, Robert. Yeah.
I'm not sure. You may want to keep a provision in for the movement of manure long distances. The economics is always an issue with this because you've got heavy trucks trying to move manure long distances, but right now you've got manure in California that is moved from the Central Valley to the coast routinely for application on the crops on the crops in the Salinas Valley. So it's a significant. I mean, it's happening now in large amounts. So that may be something you want to keep in the protocol.
Yeah, that's interesting insight. I guess to remind us all, what we're talking about is a delta that's a result of the project itself. If you're pointing to significant movements that's happening already, then my counter might be, well, we need to be careful not to penalize the farmers in this program for something that might be happening already. We absolutely should keep a close eye on whether the project itself is driving those changes. I suspect it might be other related issues, such as requirements for those concentrated animal feeding operations to manage their manure, rather than the farmer on the other end who's encouraging them to suddenly move large volumes of manure towards them, whereas otherwise they would have kept it on the animal feeding operation itself. But certainly point well taken. And then perhaps to reflect back on some of my opening remarks on this issue, let's assume we do want to account for it. We also need to think through carefully how do we do it without causing countless hours being thrown into something which is probably going to move the needle very slightly. If we had verifiers on the call, which unfortunately today I didn't think we captured, Patrick, for example, that's always a great one to throw out to them or to the prospective project developers. They're the ones that are going to have to go out and capture the data, and the verifier is going to have to check it. And the verifier will always be asking us, why are you putting these requirements in? What exactly do you want me to look at? There might be some simple thoughts, bills of lading, maybe things like that. But that would also be an issue that we should talk through carefully, assuming we get to that point. How do we cost effectively actually track, and how does a verifier tick that box? Stop it.
Sammy, it's Karen. I'm really sensitive to this one. I don't want to belabor this one, but this is some of the criticism that is leveled lately. I really want to emphasize to this group that we need to really rethink this carefully, not just within on farm, because we have not brought forward a soil organic amendment protocol in Alberta, because if the organics were going onto agricultural land in the baseline, where do they traditionally go? On ag land, then all you're doing is reallocating some of those organic amendments, and speaking mainly of manure, away from some areas and putting it more of it in the project. That is just moving it around. You have to think about the loss now of the soil organic carbon that was being built under the manure that was being applied wherever it was redirected to in the project. And so to prevent criticism and further criticism, I think we really need to be careful. If it's ICI waste that traditionally goes to landfill, and now you're diverting it into a composting situation, in Alberta, our composting protocol, we give credit for the portion of the wastes that go into composting that traditionally do not go onto agricultural land, that go into a landfill, for example. And so I really want us to think about this carefully, because we will be opening ourselves up to criticism. And so we can take it offline, but I want us to be really careful here.
Okay, that's duly noted, Karen. Let's certainly follow up, and then if we're able to craft some careful discussion points, we can maybe bring those back and share them with people. It's some interesting thoughts. Sort of makes my mind explode about the level of complexity that we'll get ourselves into. We need to measure it, we need to account for it, but we also need to not account for it. I think it could get quite complex, but let's not shy away from that, especially if you have working examples from your previous work.
Well, and I think it's fair game to say, if you are utilizing manure and creating a manure product that results in less volatilization of ammonia and less indirect nitrous oxide emissions, or a more stable form over time, maybe less methane or the process, yes, but we can't be accused of moving carbon around. It's just I'm really solid on this one, and it's going to be hard to budge me.
And Karen, I think you make a really good point. To expand on what I said before, is that the movement of the pure manure from the Central Valley to the coast is just the manure. But and check me on this, is then if you go and actually create it into compost, now you're changing the CN ratio of it, and you're actually then capturing. I think you're capturing more greenhouse gas emissions both in the composting of it and the application of it. So that's the type of practice we should be encouraging, and not just the moving of things from one place to another without any real difference to the planet.
Okay, well, certainly very interested to tease those ideas out further. Certainly we want to have a comprehensive systems approach that doesn't ignore the input, but what you're suggesting is we should perhaps come back in afterwards and net out one or two of those variables somehow. So I'm certainly very interested to explore how we could do that. First of all, being comprehensive and including that systems impact, but then secondly, perhaps some mechanism to go back in and nonetheless net out one or two of those particular contributors. It's going to be an interesting discussion, very much open to that. All right, well, there's very useful insights there. Any further thoughts on that one, or we will progress towards slide 33, which my colleagues tell me is the end point? Okay. Similar issue, this time with respect to erosion and runoff. So again, a very simplistic response there from us. Generally speaking, we do not anticipate massive increases in exposed soils. In fact, we hope it's the exact opposite as a result of the project. Therefore, somewhat of a simple shortcut. If we don't expect huge risks, then we might typically simplify and not focus in on how much exposed soil and how much erosion there is. Generally speaking, these practices should reduce erosion. I can also say that you know, we should focus in on the delta. If there's erosion in the baseline, then it would only be an increase in erosion that in particular that we should look at. We should be able to detect changes in levels of erosion through the existing monitoring mechanism. So at least we should be able to see it. Focus in on the delta. Maybe some thinking around, well, what sort of a threshold are we talking about here? If we're expecting, you know, maybe 0.5 ton per acre of the core impacts, then perhaps it would be reasonable to assume some increases in erosion aren't going to be impacting greenhouse gases in the magnitude of, you know, the bottom end of the spectrum of 0.5 acre to 2 acres. So do we need to have some sort of a threshold for the impact? And then lastly, maybe, you know, what sort of consequences are we talking about here? Let me reflect on a few and then pause. So, you know, possibly some sort of an exclusion where we just say if there's a X level of change of erosion, that's an environmental problem. Whether or not we can quantify it, we should exclude it. Maybe we exclude such fields. Alternatively, you know, we can reflect back on what we already have in the protocol. One thing that we have by way of a stick is the regulatory compliance component. So section 3.6, it's in all our protocols, which basically falls back on existing regulatory programs. If there is an existing regulatory program that says thou shalt not increase erosion or thou shalt fix erosion or else, and there's some sort of a penalty, some sort of a violation is cited, well, that we can certainly focus in on already using the existing mechanism. And the impacts there would be that, you know, let's say a particular field increased erosion and got dinged by their relevant regulator. The consequences would be that during that period where that problem was present, they wouldn't be getting credits. So that's one existing mechanism. But let me pause there. Quite a few thoughts thrown at you and see if we have any feedback.
Sammy, this is Adam, I guess. You know, this one opens up a bunch of questions for me. I don't know that you'll find many places where there's regulatory compliance on erosion. But, you know, you will have soil erosion modeling pretty common throughout the country. And so, you know, you do want to, you know, reduce airborne soils and waterborne soils. You know, is there a kind of a tolerable erosion level that is acceptable under this protocol? Because I don't think I don't see it triggering the regulatory compliance piece in many places throughout the country.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I actually just went off a small farm where there is that type of regulation in place from the California Water Board, where you know, they look at total daily maximum loads, something we see more often in forestry, where particular river systems are overloaded with erosion, you know, erosion-related problems. So there are very finite, few and far between examples, but that's a point well made. And then yes, if we think this is a problem, you know, it would be nice to get some thoughts on how do we counter that. We think we'll be able to detect it. If the consensus is that it's a problem we need to guard against, maybe we move to the next step of thinking through, you know, what do we tell the verifier? What sort of change is needed before the verifier needs to wave their finger around? And you know, let me pause there.
Hey, Sammy, it's John. I'll jump in. I've spent a lot of time thinking about erosion and soil carbon hung out with a geomorphologist that would always put his hand up in the room saying, have you considered erosion? And one of the things is erosion is actually implicitly included in most of our models because we've calibrated all our models to agricultural sites that have some variable history of a lot of erosion. So it's kind of implicitly incorporated into our losses. So while we're not directly measuring it when we take samples, it's kind of in the loss term of the models. And if anything, just about every practice that is going to be adopted is probably going to reduce erosion rates. And so if it's implicitly included in the model of the baseline and our measurements incorporate the reduction in erosion, we should probably be properly crediting it, even if the models aren't really handling it properly. So I feel pretty good about not having to explicitly think about these lateral fluxes in this context.
Yeah, I would wonder the same thing, that if we miss that flux somehow in the baseline, that would be reducing crediting if we're missing some loss in the baseline. But also all these practices should be somehow reducing this erosion in a way.
Yeah, that's some quite useful insights there. Appreciate it. Oops, I hit the mute button. Any further thoughts on this particular piece? So to reiterate, yeah, we do feel like we'll be able to capture it in monitoring. John gave some great insights into the modeling component, also implicitly capturing that. And then the thoughts move to how would we practically set a threshold or something like that, and I think we didn't quite get to some thoughts there, but the general view of the reserve is that we don't think that there's going to be significant additional erosion as a result of the project. That would be our opening presumption. Okay, well, not hearing further thoughts, perhaps we can reiterate that you can feed us those thoughts at any time in writing, or you know, raise it again later. Otherwise, perhaps we can move forward. Leakage, oh, another easy one. All right, we need to do a quick time check. 2 hours. We've got maybe 12 slides, so very good level of discussion. Certainly don't want to catch it short, but I'll try to nonetheless steer us through towards slide 33. Leakage. We shouldn't assume no loss in yields, and associated leakage should be accounted for. Assuming, and then perhaps somewhat of a counterbalancing thought, assuming a drop in yield will result in market shifting leakage isn't always true, and kind of depends on the project activity. So slightly juxtaposed positions there. But let me step back and tell you what we currently have in the protocol. So we do very much account for yield declines. They are not ignored. We have a mechanism to capture that at the field level and make sure that field and project level declines in yield will be accounted for via a deduction to overall credit issuance. And we've you know, sat down with the folks at WRI to talk that through. We think it's robust. Nonetheless, in response to the other comment, we actually think that it's you know, the information we're getting is we should not expect significant declines in yield. So we don't think it's going to be a crippling factor for projects. There may be some initial downward trend in yields as farmers adjust to a new system, but we are led to believe that those should stabilize over time. And in fact, by the end of the first crediting period, 10 years in, hopefully the farmer will start to see some of those systemic benefits, and the yield will pick back up. So we have a mechanism to deal with it, but we hope that we won't see significant fluxes in yield such that it'll move the needle significantly. Let me pause there and see if there are any thoughts.
Yeah, Sammy, this is Grayson Badgley. I have a comment on the leakage as it's discussed in the protocol right now. One of the things that is in the current formulation of leakage is it talks about sort of using actual production history and things like that. I think it's a really sound approach. I think that we could probably specify a little bit more about how that data should be used. In particular, the examples that are provided in the protocol right now talk about using sort of state level averages or cross state level averages. And I think that especially in the case of the United States, where you have county or even sub-county level resolution on these actual production histories. I think we should just specify that the finest resolution data that is available should be used. You could imagine certain types of averaging could lead to funny numbers. The average of a function isn't the function of the average. The classic idiom. So I think just like something as simple as saying use the finest resolution data that's available, and oftentimes, especially in the United States, that's going to be county level as opposed to averaging that information away.
I've got a question about that, the scope of those data. Wouldn't you want the scope of that to match the scope of the project? Because any shift in yield internal to the project is by definition not leakage.
I think that you could probably just do it on a field basis, probably. So that if you're looking at yields at a field basis, you could see if the decline of that field is declining relative to the neighbors at sort of a finer resolution of where you're going to expect things like climate and soils to at least be a little bit more similar. So it seems to me that that might be more robust.
And then are you suggesting you would then sort of roll up all of those field level comparisons to the full project level?
I mean,
so
right? You're
have
going to have to have some kind of accounting at the project level. You could imagine things where you where corn in one side of the state is low grade and all of those get the projects, and corn on the other side of the state is really high yield. So even if the yield on the project fields goes down, if you use the statewide average, you would miss leakage potentially. And so I think that it seems that just using the data that you have available and not averaging it away out the gates, it seems like a fairly easy thing to do.
Yeah, no, I think your last example though, maybe there's a little factor to the way it's written that's different from that, which is that it's a ratio. So as long as you're comparing the same thing in the baseline and the project, then it doesn't necessarily matter if it's biased in relation to that average, because you're just looking at the relationship from one to the other and how that relationship changes over time, right?
I'll have to sit down and do the math a little bit closer.
Yeah, let's perhaps follow up and maybe we can have a 2 or 3 way discussion on that, because there's definitely some important points being raised there. And I think, just to step back broadly, generalize a little bit, what we're doing with the comparison is really to normalize against, peers, for the very reasons that Grayson alluded to, that if there's some sort of a environmental condition which is pushing down yield across the whole neighborhood, well, then we would normalize the data accordingly. So we want to definitely capture yield drops, but we want to notice that if it's not directly related to the project, and it might be, say, drought that's pushing yield down, then looking at some sort of relationship with the broader community would be useful to normalize. Grayson's point's interesting that, there very well may be more granular data available there. I can tell you that we certainly have looked at such more granular level for other protocols, and what we saw is, sometimes piecemeal, the frequency of data is sort of different, and it starts to get a little bit, we're not comparing apples with apples, but certainly that idea of trying to encourage as granular as available is something that we could foreseeably move towards. But I think that there are some useful points there. And then Max is that we should step back and remember that what we should remember to do is look at the project as a whole, and really we're not so worried about movement within the project itself, or we're looking at the net impacts. But let's perhaps the 3 of us follow up, and anybody else who's interested, to see if we can tease those points out a little bit further. Anybody else, any other thoughts, or 2 of you as well, any further thoughts?
Hey, this is Adam. I'll throw out one more question, and you guys spurred it in my brain, and you can tell me to go back on mute here. Is on the counter of that, if there's a scenario where you build enhanced soil organic matter through this protocol and you actually have a higher yield, do you get benefit for that? Or I'm thinking of your scenario there where there was a drought, and these producers actually have more yield. And is there a benefit for that, or are we going to just take the conservative approach that you're at or above the average, and that's all you're going to get credit for?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll throw out some simple thoughts and see if anybody else wants to jump in, but I think it's very much the latter, that we would conservatively just sort of not account for any of the benefits associated with increased yield. To put it another way, what we're looking at is this piece of land, are the greenhouse gas impacts positive or negative? We're not then converting it to GHG impacts per ratio of output. Maybe another way to put it. In other words, we're not looking at GHG impacts per ton of grain or per unit of fat corrected milk or something like that. But let me stop there and see if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, Adam, it's Karen here. No system gives benefits for positive leakage. There's a good paper that Dr. Murray did out of the Nicholas Institute, if anybody's interested.
They would also presumably make more.
I didn't. Go ahead.
I was just going to say they have, other than the carbon benefit, potentially increased revenues from sales.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. And the only other little thing that I forgot to present on the previous slide, Sammy, and you beg my forgiveness here, is that you use the term regenerative, and I think on past calls I've been a little reticent to put that in as a response, to use that term because it doesn't have a really strong definition behind it. But in one of your responses, but I just wanted to kind of put that one in the mix as well.
Yes, faux pas on my part, Adam. Yeah, we've typically been careful not to sort of use colloquial terms and try to either create our own brand new colloquial term or just keep it simple. But 15-hour day yesterday, I guess we got a little bit sloppy right at the end, so my apologies.
Sammy, I'm trying to remember our past conversations. It's Karen here. We talked about sort of 5-year rolling averages of yield. Like, if there was a yield drop, is it because they had a localized crappy weather situation going on? I think of the COVID graphs that we get state by state, and they're 5 or 7 day rolling averages to show true differences in states. Is there a reason why we're not going to look at the lowest granular data available, but maybe a 5-year rolling average?
I think that's what the current proposal actually has us do. It is somewhat aggregated data over an extended period of time tied to insurance payments. So we don't think farmers are going to game it because they're going to lose out on insurance and possibly get kicked out of the system, and that would be a significant detriment to them relative to modest offset revenues. But let me pause there and see if any other colleagues can jump in with specifics. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there is some extended period averaging that's included in that data set.
Great.
Yeah, Sammy, you're right. You're right on that. And then Karen, that also comes back to the ratio issue. So if there is a drop in yield that's sort of exogenous to the project and affects both within and outside of project fields, then that won't change the ratio of the project to the average. Everybody drops.
Okay, thanks.
All right, excuse me, there might be an echo. I was just pausing to grab some water. Give me 1 sec. So the next question, excuse me, maybe I'll just move on, but jump out if you want me to go back, but this is a fairly related issue. What about livestock? So we just talked about cropping and changes in yield. What about livestock? Should we move to more finite accounting of changes in livestock outputs? Let's see the specifics. Project shouldn't have an impact on livestock populations. Consider removing livestock leakage. So, from one corner we're saying we don't anticipate a change, so why not just strip it out? And let's look at the second comment. Livestock leakage should instead be based on animal and hectare instead of grazing days. So two different perspectives there. Let's step back one sec. So just to recap, we do have a mechanism in place that looks at the number of animals and also the time over which the animals are grazing. So we do not just look at area, we do also look at time. So just one point to clarify. But again, we stop short of translating that to, you know, numbers of steaks coming out at the end or weighing the animals at the end. We think there could be some practical challenges associated with that don't necessarily add value relative to the level of information. But generally speaking, if there's a change in the level of grazing, if there's a drop, and if it's significant enough, that would result in a reduction in emission reductions across all of the emissions reductions issued for the project. So we think it's a robust approach. We don't expect it to be penalising projects left, right, and centre because we don't foresee significant drops in the level of grazing. Let me stop there and see if folks want to jump. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to click it over. But again, feel free to jump out if you want to continue the discussion. Quantification, another simple one, no doubt. Comment, consider using default factors for a number of practices. There's good sources of practices, literature there, as direct samples may have high variability. Default factors will also have high variability. Nonetheless, we do have a good range of default factors and equations in there already for a subset of the changes, the practice changes that we're looking at. And we've sourced them from best available information, IPCC, and also US EPA. In fact, one of our good friends on the call helped us understand that, you know, we can maybe even tighten that up further and move more towards US EPA from the more general IPCC. Very similar, but let's move towards that source. So generally speaking, yes, we do think it's a good idea, and we try to include as many as we can. Let me stop there and see if there's any further feedback.
So then, Sammy, why not include references to the nitrogen management protocol and the emissions factors there? There isn't a crosswalk to that, and you guys did some great work with the nitrogen protocol. It may be worth building that into this as allowable quantification.
Oof, that's a good thought. Robert, we've had so many discussions. I don't know that I've heard you say that before. It's a good idea. Might be a bit late in the game, but certainly that's a good idea. So what Robert's saying is, in essence, we put a significant amount of effort into building out default equations using a biogeochemical model. We hired model creators from the best in the world to run the model themselves and come up with a bunch of brand new defaults. And Robert's saying, well, why not bring those over if you have them tucked away? It's a good thought. Just to clarify, we have a bunch of defaults and equations, but they are not the ones that we created ourselves on the nitrogen management side. Good thought, maybe we should consider also including some of those default factors here. And what those would do is, with respect to changes in the amount of fertilizers used, that could allow for a simple use of those drop-down defaults, as opposed to instead modeling those impacts using biogeochemical models or using the US EPA defaults. It's an interesting thought, Robert. Let's noodle on that one further.
Hey, Sammy, this is Adam, and I guess I'll jump in on that as well. You know your protocols and your, kind of transaction volume much better than I do. But it seems like the utilization of the kind of the meta modeling analysis lookup table approaches, where you can use them, seem to give way to and associated tools. Let me put it that way, like your grass tool, give way to more project development work because it reduces the transaction cost a little bit for the folks involved and makes it just a little bit more transparent, at the onset of a project. And and it would seem like we would try to pull in as much of that expertise that you all have, much more than I do, as much as possible to bear here, which is just a learning over the past decade or decade and a half.
Yeah, let me try to summarize your points and some thoughts in response. So, you know, we've spent a lot of time and energy building out defaults using these complex models. If they're used, they could be cost effective rather than hiring your own independent expert and running the models again, as we envisage for this protocol. Why not use as many available defaults as possible? Yeah, it's a good thought. You know, a short answer in terms of transaction volumes, we haven't seen our nitrogen protocol used broadly. So the volumes are 0, roughly speaking. And so part of the challenge there sort of feeds back into that holistic additionality discussion. If we build a protocol that focuses in on just a few discrete areas that we have enough data to, you know, be very sure about the common practice piece, it ends up being a, you know, small subset of the available options, the available parts of the country, etc. We end up with a protocol that, you know, it could be a challenge for projects to come in and make sufficient wins to be able to justify the project. Hence, for this activity, you know, our starting piece was, how do we make this as broadly applicable as possible to try to get levels of emission reductions that justify investing in a project? So part of the challenge is, let's build it so it's broader than what we did in nitrogen management. That wasn't enough. The market's telling us that's not enough. That doesn't mean we can't go in and, as you and Robert have suggested, and nonetheless cannibalize some of the quantification pieces. I think we can continue to consider that and maybe try to introduce that as another default option, which could reduce the costs here specifically for that one type of opportunity, which is reducing nitrogen. But again, we would expect projects to try to bundle that together with as many others of these activities as possible, or else it's going to be very challenging to actually have a project with just one type of practice in just a small subset of potential farms out there. All right, this is great feedback and some good ideas coming out there as well, which is some food for thought. So really much appreciate that. In the interest of time, I'll keep moving down the page. Comments: default emission factors change over time. A dynamic approach factoring in soil texture, cropping, rainfall, N2O emissions would better reflect actual emissions. So again, we do already allow for default equations and emission factors, but also modeling. We anticipate the modeling is going to be used more often, but we're getting some feedback here that you know, you should at least provide that option to folks and let the market decide even when they use those different defaults. The defaults will tend to be more conservative too, is generally the idea, and that's built into some of the assumptions in the quantification when we're building those defaults. And then just broadly speaking, we'll update both whenever updates are available. So we're not sitting still on, you know, one model from the 80s. Anytime there's a model update, they'll be required to update to the latest version. And again, we'll update the emission factors and the equations as they're updated. And then ideas like Robert's, where we can maybe also bring our own emission factors and make sure we update those periodically. Let me pause there, see if there's any thought. Okay. Last point, nice and simple. Oh yeah, go ahead.
If you don't mind, I'm going to go back to leakage just for a minute. As a producer that has been within this group of fairly isolated group of people that have been out on the cutting edge of no-till and cover crops and etc. I know firsthand from our local university at Oklahoma State that there was inherent bias against no-till. So some of that early research, much of it, I would say the majority of that early research having to do with a yield decline in the early years of no-till was being done and conducted by those that were heavily biased against it. The devil's in the details when you look at some of that research. I know personally, and all of those, without one exception, of 20 or 30 guys that I know of that are very well versed in quote unquote regenerative ag and cover crops and they're out on the cutting edge, none of us had a loss in yield even in the first years. And I think that a lot of that has to do with new technology, new ability to do research, and that farmers that do this are not going to want to do it if they're going to lose yield. So they're going to be out there researching and learning and understanding. And I would also say that anyone that uses this protocol and goes out and sets their own carbon program, they're going to be wanting to advise, and that advice will be largely done by people that are pro no-till. Therefore, they're going to have a good idea and a good understanding of how to take a new practice and make it profitable, even profitable above and beyond what they might be earning in carbon credits. So really my emphasis too, and hoping to ease some minds in that leakage, is that I see very, very little loss in yield or loss in production due to these added practices. And also overall, within the whole project, there will be a significant increase in profitability and yields.
Yeah, that's good news, and that certainly reflects some of the agronomic advice and literature that we've been reading. That sure, let's build a mechanism in just in case, but what we're seeing and hearing is that certainly over a few years' time, hopefully the farmers will be stabilising and increasing their yields. So we certainly hope for that result. So yeah, appreciate that. All right, just taking a quick glance at my watch. We've got half an hour left. We're not quite towards the end, so I'll try to gently steer us through a little bit more briskly, perhaps, but obviously being respectful to the audience and generating that really useful discussion. So let's try to balance a little bit of the two. Try not to be too much of a rocket man, but let's get us towards the end here. That last comment, consider moving towards more updated global warming potentials. We know that there's great work being done. AR5's out now. Why don't you move towards that? Simple response. All the offset programs, for some reason, tend to move at different times towards updated global warming potentials. Even when we do, we will do it as a program as a whole. So certainly we pay close attention, and we can tell you that eventually we will be moving up. As to exactly when, we don't quite know at this stage, and we'll signal clearly to make sure everybody knows well in advance, and then we will move forward. We tend to be lockstep with the California program, just based on our historical nexus with them. So that's kind of a little bit background in terms of why we haven't already moved up. Let me pause there in case there are any questions, but I think that one's a relatively simple one. All right. And keep moving. There's a lot more here. Model guidance and validation, insufficient model validation for field level application, coming out of our good colleagues at EDF. So just to step back a little bit, we do allow for projects of any size, but practically speaking, we anticipate projects are going to be at the broader landscape scale. And so generally speaking, these models are much more accurate. The uncertainty is lower at those broader scales, and that's what we anticipate will come. As you know, we've crafted model validation, calibration guidance. It's in a separate document. We've just shared with you an updated version of that. So we've been working closely with Workgroup modeling experts, including developers of two of the most well-respected models out there, one on the Workgroup, one external to the Workgroup. So we encourage you to take a good look at that document closely. I can tell you it's been updated following extensive further discussions with a range of different parties who put their hand up that are expert in the use of models. And let's just step back generally and walk through some points here. So model validation requirements specify the model must be validated using statistically robust data sets separate from those used model calibration. A model validation report must then receive independent expert review and will be a public document. So we're just clarifying the process a little bit. Sometimes those details get a bit lost. So there will be independent expert review of the validation. So somebody else can step in and say, yes, we agree, or no, we don't. The model must be shown to be unbiased or conservatively biased in its predictions. And then a very big piece is the uncertainty requirements and the deductions accordingly. That model prediction error will be reflected in those uncertainty calculations, and it will result in a reduction in emission reductions accordingly. And then also lastly, well, a couple more points. We require the updating of models as soon as a newer version is available. So hopefully that'll improve with the uncertainty over time. And then also this particular protocol has a quantification approach that requires us to periodically look at direct measurements. So if there was still inherent problems associated with the model, every few years there would be a balance with a direct measurement. And at that point, there'll be a little bit of a true up. But certainly a subject that's had a lot of input from the work group, and we expect more feedback accordingly. But let me pause there and see if anybody wants to jump in and offer some thoughts.
Sorry, Sammy, I haven't looked into EDF's comments, but I hope that wasn't all they gave. Did they talk about what they wanted to see for sufficient model validation?
I think let's take that discussion offline. I would encourage you to read their feedback directly, just in the interest of time, noting that we've got half an hour left and still 10 slides. But take a look at it and let's engage further, noting that you know, your team from Varesco did provide extensive time carefully looking through it and providing input. So also I can note for you that, as we mentioned earlier, we're reaching out to each of these parties that have provided public comments and looking to sit down and talk it through with them. So with respect to this particular commenter, we will be having those follow-up discussions with them, and you know, we can perhaps bring those back to the work group if people are interested.
Sammy, there's a related comment here. I think it's from the carbon plan letter about the how the models need to be public and peer reviewed in the scientific literature. I applaud you for making it a public document, but and this may be more in quantification than model guidance, but the practices that are used in models to do the parameterization and the validation should come from publicly available peer-reviewed scientific literature. I think that's, there are some valid points, again, both here in EDF and in Carbon Plan about concerns raised about private data being used that isn't available to be checked or confirmed or any of that. So I think that's something that needs a little bit more work and a little bit more thought.
Okay, yeah, appreciate those thoughts. So just to clarify, there absolutely will be publicly available data, peer-reviewed data that's used as primary source for the validation efforts. Those requirements are spelt out explicitly in the model validation guidance. So I'd recommend everybody goes and takes a good look at that. And once you've read the detail, provide us feedback if you think we still need further. There will be an independent expert that will then check the validation report that's made public and to confirm whether they agree with the results in that public report. So there'll be multiple steps at which we can go in and confirm whether it's, somebody drawing with crayon on the back of a piece of paper, or whether it is indeed sufficiently scientifically robust data that's used to validate models. So we think the checks and balances are appropriate. I can tell you a moving piece that's still in motion is that we are getting together with some of our peers in other registries, talking through whether we can also put together a independent scientific advisory committee, which might provide an extra layer that helps us periodically update the model validation guidance. But to be clear, I'm not a model expert. So what we did is we reached out to people who are the actual developers of two of the most respected models available today, and they are the ones that crafted this guidance that we've shared with you. So in their expert opinion, they feel like it's robust, but certainly happy to take as much feedback as possible and see if we can refine that further.
Hey, Sammy, it's John. Maybe I misconstrued EDF's comments. I just looked through it again. And I guess I felt their issue with it was less so, it was just that it's impractical to validate at every field, and there needs to be this kind of landscape level approach. And so I think your thinking a proposed change doesn't really address that aspect of their concern. And I mean, I think they're totally right in that comment that we're not validating for every field in a project. And so what does that mean? I guess maybe just some more thinking about what that means for being unbiased at the regional or landscape scale, I think was kind of what they were getting at. If, at least that was my read of their like high level comments on modeling.
Yes, so appreciate that distinction. Again, you know, we're 2.5 hours into this and we're nowhere near the end, so it's not really possible for us to walk through every single comment in finite detail. So I would encourage you all to go out there and read them. They're publicly available, and let us know if you want to talk through the specifics. And we certainly are going to be engaging with each of these parties, including with the commenter here in particular. We haven't had that discussion yet. We will shortly. So certainly, you know, if I'm paraphrasing that's unhelpful, then I apologize for that. But yes, we will work closely with these parties on some of those issues. If you had any further feedback as to how we can make improvements, then absolutely we'd love for you to be able to contribute either directly into that model validation guidance or just more broadly.
You know, Sammy, you'd mentioned before about the independent expert review. It may make sense to try to look at criteria for that to make it clear. You've done a really good job with verifiers and the requirements, and you know, having them to be ANSI certified and things of that nature. I think we have I think having some criteria there would be helpful. I do question a little bit of having CSU and Dagan as the ones reviewing and comment on it. I mean, they know the models. They're very, very knowledgeable on it, but they're not necessarily independent. They have a stake in this for their models to be used. So I think having some other modeling folks as independent expert reviewers, I think would be really beneficial, and having some criteria about what they need to be and how they need to be, how their independence needs to be demonstrated.
Right, good feedback. Just broadly speaking, you know, we're a small nonprofit. Everybody on the work group is volunteering their time. These folks who are no doubt experts at the use of their particular model, and they've used other models extensively, have volunteered their time. If there are other experts that you think you can recommend that we approach, then we can graciously ask them if they can volunteer their time. But other than that, it's a little bit hard to be able to elicit more than what we already have, but certainly we're open to it. And another point, these documents, the model validation guidance, are public, protocols publicly posted, these public feedback comments are posted. So certainly we're not trying to hide this in the dark corners of the web or anything like that. And if there are specific suggestions for improvements, we're all ears. So definitely appreciate the feedback, and perhaps this is one where we can continue to try to make improvements. And then, you know, it might be the end of the day that we have several distinguished experts sitting around with different views. And unfortunately, what will be required then is it will fall on our shoulders to make a decision where we think it's safe to move forward. Let me move to the next comment, which is related. How about you provide a list of acceptable models? Don't just talk about models, give us a specific list. Some proposed models may be unfamiliar to the reserve. Not enough transparency or clarity around models. So yes, feedback is duly noted. A general approach is not to be prescriptive. Instead, we try to point to minimum requirements. So, you know, some simple things like it needs to be peer reviewed. It can't be something you make yourself out of paper mache with your kids. And then reflect back on that validation guidance as discussed above. Not only does the model itself need to be peer reviewed, you can't just go and use it for whatever you see fit. You would have to follow the model validation guidance. And clearly there are a number of parties that are continuing to provide a range of views with respect to that. So we welcome that ongoing discussion. Also, we can write in specific examples, in particular DNDC and Comet Farm. If there are specific feedback on those or alternatives, we're very, very happy to take it. These particular commenters want us to be a bit more prescriptive, so we will explore that further. Okay, so let's keep it ticking over, 20 minutes left. model validation, model guidance and validation. Qualifications for model acceptability are inadequate, not enough transparency to allow for independent replication. I think Robert touched on that. Too much reliance on modeling team without enough oversight by verifiers. So suggestion to talk about, you know, specific qualifications of the expert who's going to look at the validation. Maybe we also need an expert on the model on the verification team. Great feedback. If we can try to tease out some finite ideas, then we'd be very happy to consider including it. You know, we've spent a lot of time on this and we haven't come up with anything, you know, including with these partners, but if somebody has concrete thoughts, for sure we can explore whether we include more specific guidance. Typically speaking, when it comes to verification teams, our expert project developers and verifiers would push back against absolutely mandating some sort of expert, but we will revisit that idea nonetheless. There could be some use in mandating an expert. Of course, then we'll get asked, well, how do we determine expertise? I don't think there's a simple tick the box we can point to, so that's going to be a challenge. So let's explore that a little bit further. Let's see. Sorry for racing, just trying to get through this. Let's see if there's anything else that jumps out. Oh, the verifier is not required to assess model performance beyond the bias. Oh, sorry, that's reserve thinking. Regarding the notion that there's no guidance for verifiers to confirm model performance in terms of accuracy, precision, predictability, future conditions, we assert the quantifiable impact of model performance is by requirement accounted for in the calculation of model prediction error. So again, getting back to that complex uncertainty requirements tucked in at the back of the protocol. Therefore, the verifier is not required to assess model performance beyond assessing the results there. We believe it's not possible to set performance benchmarks that will meaningfully apply across all models. Model validation should be expected to be model specific and site specific. And in the case of peer review, should be judged within the relevant context by an expert. So again, take a look at the updated guidance and hopefully we're moving in the right direction. But again, very happy to take continued thoughts on how to refine that and improve it. Let me pause there to see if parties would like to provide some input. Okay. Again, these are issues where we're getting a lot of good feedback, so continue to share those with us. Email, type it in the chat box, and we can review it later. We probably will run out of time on this meeting, but let's keep moving and see if we have more time towards the end. But again, take a good look at what's already written, and let's engage heavily as much as we need to see if we can to refine it further. Uncertainty. Uncertainty approach is overly complex. Model uncertainty would be difficult, insufficient, and not useful unless applied at a landscape scale. So that gets back to, I think, a comment that John made. It was, you know, a slightly different comment that EDF was making. Yep, we'll recognise that here. So with respect to the uncertainty being overly complex, yes, agreed. So what we're trying to do is craft a Excel-based tool that can enshrine all of those calculations and hopefully simplify it. But generally speaking, we think that the complex uncertainty requirements there will allow us to account for some of these concerns with respect to the use of models to be able to, where the resulting uncertainty is high, to force the projects to account for that with a robust reduction in emission reductions. So probably won't get to a level of precision, we never will, but nonetheless, where uncertainty is high, there will be an accounting explicitly for that, which requires a balance between complexity and these robust requirements that we have. Let me pause there and see if there are specific thoughts on this call.
Hi, Sammy, it's Grayson again. I was wondering if you could, about the why 15% uncertainty is sort of, you know, spotted to the project developers, right? You know, as long as your uncertainty is not above 15%, the uncertainty, as far as my understanding of the calculation, is considered to be, we ignore that. And one of the things I wonder about that is that, you know, wouldn't it be interesting to sort of see what the uncertainty that the market can tolerate is, of where, you know, if someone is actually capable of achieving 5% uncertainty, they would have a financial advantage to that. Whereas if we sort of have a fixed uncertainty amount that we specify to people, no one ever has any incentive to go below 15% uncertainty, because they're always going to get spotted 100% of the credits even when they cross that threshold.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that there was any. Well, I think part of your question was there any literature to justify that? I believe I read that from you previously. I think short answer, no. I think we just sort of went for something that we thought would be statistically defensible. 15% of the 95 confidence interval is, sort of a range that we use, in various parts of different protocols. I think that's the short answer. An interesting point about what if we forced an accounting at every single point where there's uncertainty, and just let the market decide. Yeah, it's a good point, I guess, just to simplify things and to allow for a little bit of room for the needle to move without necessitating a deduction. We think is generally reasonable across the board. But let me pause there and see if there are any better informed stakeholders that might want to offer some thoughts on that. No.
Yeah, if no one wants to jump in, it just seems that what that will drive is that you'll do a minimum amount of sampling to get to the 15% or 14.5%, and then you don't ever have any incentive to push your sampling or your modeling any further, because you're gonna be always spotted as the project developer. You're gonna be spotted at 15%. And I understand wanting to sort of flywheel it and subsidize in some uncertainty scenarios, but it also just seems like maybe that, I don't know. It seems to me that sort of thinking through a way to make that uncertainty dynamic could be an interesting way for project developers to compete against each other, all driving towards having the strongest projects as opposed to sort of being satisfied with 15%.
So slightly more dynamic than where we currently have, in other words.
Yeah, it's Karen here. Actually, these quality criteria are really high compared to a lot of the other voluntary programs and standards, and I was quite surprised to see them at a 95% confidence interval at 15%. So these are high for carbon markets and biological systems. So I mean, I applaud you for being so strict.
I'd note from a project development perspective, having run the numbers on our own projects, that it would take an impossible level of sampling for us to get below the 15% probably with existing, because you're wrapping in other sources of uncertainty. It's not just the sampling.
Right, but then why get credited for that carbon?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, there's, as Karen is saying, this is already a stricter standard than is common.
Absolutely. I just think that you could just give 85% of the credits, or if you have 20% uncertainty, you give 80% of the credits. The 15%, I mean, I'm not saying, I think that it's fantastic that uncertainty is being accommodated at all these different levels. It's just not quite clear to me that, now, if what you're saying is that the uncertainty on most of these projects is going to be 40%, and then we want to spot them 15, I think that's a totally different conversation. And I think that that's potentially something that I think that sort of being able to tease out those two scenarios of where there's just 40% uncertainty, and so this 15% is critical. That makes sense to me. But in a world where it's well, will do less sampling so that we never push below that 15%. But we could, and maybe someone comes up with a way to do that in the future. It seems to me having that, it seems to me that, yeah, I think there needs to be a little bit more conversation about how that uncertainty subsidy, I guess, or that spotted uncertainty gets calculated.
So this is John. I jump in for a second. There's a big difference between uncertainty and biased uncertainty. So as long as your uncertainty is unbiased, it actually doesn't matter that much across your project domain. And so this has been like the bane of digital soil mappers forever. You could have fairly uncertain data and create a really good map as long as you're confident that uncertainty, that your error is unbiased. And so emphasis on bias is really important here, almost more important than the absolute uncertainty.
Well, we appreciate that. Perhaps this is an example of an issue that we can continue to deliberate on. Perhaps we can invite everybody who's spoken, John, Grayson, Max, Karen, and anybody else who's interested. Maybe we could sort of convene a sidebar and keep the discussion going. But let's perhaps follow up offline and see if you folks are interested in continuing to exchange ideas. How does that sound? Does that sound might be useful?
Sounds fantastic.
Yep.
Great. Thanks, folks. Soil sampling guidance, and that's another easy one. Insufficient guidance. Need to be clear about requiring bulk density sampling. Need a number of samples per acre hardwired in, and you need to sample down to 1 meter. So this is going to be tough. There's a lot of good, strong issues here. And what we've done here in throwing down some simple thoughts in response is to break it out by issue. Insufficient guidance. So, I mean, if there's better guidance we can give, we'll certainly look at it. I think, you know, starting position is we try to give a range of minimums, and then we leave it to the market to decide, bearing in mind that they need to account for the uncertainty associated with the sampling. Let them decide how much of a penalty they want to take, and hopefully they'll be driven towards more sampling to bring those to balance the associated costs. That's a simple response. With respect to bulk density, we should clarify our guidance because it absolutely will be included in both the direct sampling as well as modeling input. So definitely it is already included, and we'll just do a better job at explaining that. Number of samples per acre or per hectare or whatever. I think that's similar to the response with respect to the guidance. We tend to prescribe minimum requirements, and we leave it up to the projects themselves to account for the associated haircut inherent in the uncertainty that results from their choice of number of samples. That sort of reflects the general approach that we see in offset protocols the world over, to kind of defer to the projects to decide how they get out to their terrain and you know, make their own minds up, with the idea being that over time they'll develop better methods and reduce their costs and just keep refining it so the uncertainty keeps going down and down. That's a general theory. And then we'll pause and let folks jump in for any of these. But let me get that last one, and then we'll throw the mic open. Need to sample down to 1 meter. So this is one we've discussed extensively, and I think maybe where we've come to is that we seem to have a consensus telling us that it is safe to move forward prescribing an absolute minimum of 30 centimeters for sampling. Nonetheless, we encourage folks to sample deeper. Nonetheless, we also have a good number of well-informed parties telling us that deeper sampling might show us that there are different results than you would see in the top 30 centimeters. So we should move towards that. One part of the reason why we're not mandating deeper measurements is that currently the models are not capable of inputting that data to those deeper measurements. We are told that that capability should be coming in updated models. So perhaps at that time we can, you know, we certainly will be requiring the use of the most up-to-date version, but maybe at that time we can say, awesome, now it's ready, let's tweak it a little bit further. Plus we have extensive feedback that it's quite common to sample down to 30 centimeters, both coming from soil science experts that we're talking to, as well as project developers and other stakeholders. That was a lot. Let me pause there, and some of the sort of discussion bleeds over to the next page, but let me stop there. Let me just quickly note as well, we're into the last 7 minutes, but certainly let us know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, Sammy, it's Grayson again. I definitely have I think the minimum 30 centimeters, especially in projects where there's a transition from till to no till, I think it really has to grapple with the literature that shows that there's vertical redistribution of soil organic carbon. I mean, I previously sent you these papers from the late 2000s and sort of that have been cited again about how, you know, just below the plow depth, you tend to lose soil carbon and you start to gain soil carbon above where the plow depth used to be. And again, those might just be momentary dynamics, but it seems to me that there's a real possibility of overcrediting if you fix 30 centimeters in the instance of where you stop tilling. And so I just think that's something that, I think it's something that we definitely have to grapple with, because I haven't been able to find a convincing set of literature that refutes that notion.
Yes, I think that's a very useful point. So to be clear, we're not saying that we've seen literature that refutes it either. What we're saying is we nonetheless seem to have a good number of folks that say, nonetheless, move forward with 30 centimeters. Even when we can go deeper, we absolutely recommend it. But right now, it's probably reasonable to move forward with the 30 centimeter samples, knowing that there's a couple
I think
of
that literature
safeguards.
directly contradicts that. I think that it's like a meta-analysis of a lot of these no-till studies. I think it's fine. I think it's probably fine when you're not dealing with tillage changes. But I think when you're going from till to no-till, I think that there's a real potential to get ourselves in a pickle. And I don't know. It's just my sense. Yeah, I don't know.
Mitchell, my main concern with on this is going to be the cost to the farmer or to the project developer on how carried away we get here. And just concerned that the cost of gathering some of the data, the cost of the sampling, especially to really deep depths and lots of samples, for every field, although it will definitely increase the accuracy for sure, I think it increases the cost that much faster. If we do really bulk this up a lot. So that's just my initial thoughts on making sure that the economics of all this have to work out for the people that are paying for the sampling here too, while getting as accurate as we possibly can, and then factor in as many trials at different depths, at different protocols, to help us to fine tune and to be able to draw the correlations to that more robust sampling versus what can be done feasibly out in the field at scale.
Yeah, I think that more often than not, I would agree with that. But I think that right here, the mechanism that this literature seems to be pointing to is that it's the mechanical mixing from the till that's causing accumulation of carbon just below where you used to till. And when you stop tilling, you start to lose that. And so what you are gaining in the top 30, you're losing in the bottom, you're losing just below plow depth. So I'm not sure that means we need to go to 1 meter, but it seems like we probably need to at least go below plow depth in instances where we switch from till to no till. Otherwise, it's not real reduction.
Sure, that's great feedback. And just to confirm, it's not going to be sort of one-off efforts. This is going to be ongoing over 30 years. So if there are sort of temporary impacts, then coming back and resampling later and remeasuring are going to hopefully sort of tease that out over a 30-year trajectory and going forward. So there will be opportunities to come back and revisit, certainly. Just a couple of quick points. We haven't decided on this 30 centimeter fact based on cost. We have had extensive feedback that going deeper will be cost prohibitive, but it wasn't the cost discussion that really led us to our position. It's more that there was a significant number of feedback that suggested that this is appropriate when taken into the broader context of some of those other checks and balances we've talked about, the uncertainty deductions, mixing in the modeling with the direct sampling and the range of other metrics we have in there. But just to recap, we are absolutely cognizant that there are some well-informed views that going deeper is probably where we're going to end up. Maybe I'll pause there and see if there's other thoughts. Couple of minutes left, actually. So maybe if we can table this discussion as well and note that this is one where we've had extensive discussion and we should expect it to continue. This is certainly an area where we're receiving a lot of good feedback. Just in the interest of time, I might keep moving. We're not going to make it almost. Okay, let me go. Let me excuse. If you're able to stick around a couple of minutes longer, that'd be great. If not, I'll try to move through these briskly and we can remind you that you have the slides in this GUI. We can send you a copy. We'll put them online and we welcome feedback in writing at any point. Also follow-up discussions. With respect to permanence, should be more transparency around acceptable alternatives. We are going to be making changes to make those more robust. So we're going to remove this idea of terminating monitoring automatically after 5 years. We heard a lot of feedback on that. So that's a change we can make immediately. And we're considering if and when we do look at an alternative mechanism, that maybe we can publish it and open it up for public comment. Again, we're not committed to making any alternatives available by right. It's more that we are willing to entertain ideas. Maybe we can sort of improve the transparency by going out to the public at that point. That's one idea that we have. But in the interest of time, again, let me keep going. Excuse me for that. Confusion over how tenure accounting works. So it is relatively complex. I would say to you, if you're interested in discussing the specifics, reach out to us, and we'll certainly be doing that with the specific parties that have given us feedback on tenure accounting. Very happy to walk through that with folks. In terms of the buffer pool, some feedback that says parameters aren't justified, means to reduce contributions aren't appropriate. One quick point to note that the Reserves Program Manual actually makes it clear that the reserve will step in and cover reversals should the buffer pool be insufficient. So really the buffer pool is there as an insurance policy for the reserve primarily. We will step in if it's insufficient. That's one point. And in essence, we work closely with the work group to try to identify specific data that can help inform what that level of risk is. Short answer is it doesn't exist. So we need to try to craft a minimum regardless. We did that. We got a lot of pushback on work group meetings to lower those thresholds. Reluctantly, I think we lowered it slightly, and we're still getting pushback to say that we shouldn't have it so high. So it's always going to be a range of views there. Certainly reach out to us in writing, or if you want to have a discussion about more of those specifics. Otherwise, excuse me, and I'll move on. We're almost at the end here. Verification. Verifiers should replicate randomized soil samples. That's something that we're considering further. So we definitely appreciate work group feedback on that. We've had a lot of feedback already saying that it's cost prohibitive, but nonetheless, let's continue to explore it further. We're getting feedback to say that it is something that could be very useful. Modeling exercises should be reviewed by verifiers and replicated if possible. There's nothing in the protocol to prevent that. We're suggesting that it might not be strictly necessary in all instances, and we gave examples of specific scenarios where we think it might not be necessary, but certainly it's up to a verifier to use their own professional discretion. Number of fields visited should be increased. That's a good one. So we're looking closely at that and seeing if we can maybe ramp up the minimum number, especially once we start to get to those larger project sizes, which is really what the feedback was honing in on. So we're currently playing around with those concepts and seeing if we can maybe sort of tie it in at a minimum at a point where the project starts to get larger and the total percentage of fields relative to the number of total fields starts to drop. So yes, we're going to look closely at that. Appreciate that feedback. Some other feedback to say site visits should be based on farms instead of fields. Some other feedback to suggest we prefer performing site visits to at least one concentrated area of fields. That's coming from an expert verifier. Visiting a large number of fields across multiple states makes site visits costly and unreasonably so. Sure, there's always going to be a bit of a balance there, so we need to continue to refine it to make sure it's not too liberal, but at the same time think through practically what the implications are. So we very much welcome ongoing discussions, sort of moving us in opposite directions there. A little bit by way of next steps. So just to recap, we are continuing to discuss these issues with all the public commenters, and I think we flag at least a couple of maybe sidebar discussions that folks might be interested in, including workgroup members. So we're going to continue to do that at least through the end of June, but as needed, indefinitely. We've already committed to another public comment period. Let's say July. Just people need to have dates to get a general sense, but again, the short message is we're going to take as much time as needed to make sure we're able to fully appreciate the feedback. And lastly, people have been asking us a lot about, well, when's it going to go to the board? Short answer is we don't know. We're taking more time now to make sure that we're able to engage with folks who are giving us good feedback. But just to throw a date out there, September 30th is our next full board meeting. So in theory, we'll work towards that as a date. Certainly, we're not hardwiring any dates in at this point. We're going to take time to work through these issues with the work group and have another public comment webinar, public comment period, and if we need to, another work group meeting. So, but there's some indicative timeframes. Next steps, as it was for the previous meetings, you've got our policy email address there. Send us written comments, ideally organized by protocol section, but just get in touch, generally speaking. If you want to set up one-on-ones, that's great. We also noodled on maybe pulling 2 or 3 of us together for some of those discussions that we cut somewhat short from today's session. So we can have as many of those as you folks like. We've had a number of sub-work group meetings. That was really useful. We can pull together more if folks need, so reach out anytime and we can help coordinate. Feel free to reach out to each other if you want to cross-fertilize without us directly involved. That's also, could be very useful, so feel free. Submit feedback anytime. We're going to have a public comment period, but the sooner and more often you engage, most likely you'll give us a better chance to be able to incorporate your thoughts into improving. So, don't be shy, reach out. Sooner rather than later will probably be the most productive, but we defer to you on that. And what will we do? We'll keep working. Here's our email addresses. You have those in the slides. Again, please feel free to reach out anytime. I might just stop there and give a general big thank you to everybody. I mean, we can sort of stay on the line a little bit longer, but that's perhaps not fair for some folks who have to leave. But let me pause at this point and see if anybody wants to keep talking at this point, or whether we defer to some of those other mechanisms to continue the discussions. But thanks, folks.
Hey, Sammy,
really appreciate it.
Hey, Sammy, this is Adam. Real quickly, version control question. Are you going to be sending us a new version that we can look at? I thought I heard you say that today, but I wanted to make sure.
Yeah, definitely. And some of the feedback from workgroup members was, well, we didn't have enough time last time, so we absolutely will, and we'll try to give you as much time as possible before we then move to the next step, which would be a public comment period. So at some point, it's just, we haven't had a chance to actually do that yet. We're still talking with commenters, but yes, we'll definitely get you a polished up, full, updated draft and give you a big chunk of time to review it before any key next step.
Perfect. Thank you. Great job today.
Hey, Sammy, thank you for you and all of the team's work on this. It has been, it's not an easy process, and I know there's been lots of opinions and lots of concerns raised. So a nice job kind of getting us through this and listening to what we all have to say.
Agreed. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sammy. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, folks. Really appreciate the sentiments. And again, yes, look, inclusivity, trying to make sure we have those discussions will be great. So expect us to reach out to you. But again, we've got 1,000 moving pieces here for a small staff. If we haven't got back to you yet, don't be shy. Reach out and say, hey, remember you said that we would talk about this thing, and let's all work together to make sure we capture as much of your feedback as possible. But yeah, thanks again, folks. It was a really good turnout, really good level of discussion, exactly what we need. So we're all very much appreciative of that. So thanks again, folks.